I was sitting in a coffee shop staring at a photo of my missing son when the man across from me said, "You are still looking for him." He set a file down. "Everything about the kidnapping 35 years ago is in here." I asked how he knew. He said, "Because I am the kid in that photo." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is Antoine. I am 69 years old and currently pushing a heavy industrial mop bucket across the pristine marble lobby of a high-end corporate building. I work the late shift scrubbing floors long after the executives have gone home. Tonight is different. Brent, my arrogant son-in-law and the chief executive officer of the top-floor development firm, steps out of his private glass elevator. He is surrounded by a flock of wealthy investors, wearing custom-tailored suits and laughing loudly at some inside joke. Brent wears his wealth like a weapon. He spots me instantly. The polished stone floor squeaks under my taped-up work boots. I keep my head down and continue dragging the heavy mop across the tiles, focusing solely on the dirty water in the bucket. I know exactly what kind of man Brent is. I know what he is about to do before he takes a step in my direction. Brent detaches himself from his group of investors and alters his path to intercept me. He walks with an aggressive stride, ensuring his expensive leather shoes clip the edge of my heavy yellow mop bucket. He intentionally kicks the side of the plastic container with tremendous force. The bucket tips violently, crashing onto the immaculate marble floor and spilling gallons of filthy gray water across the pristine walkway. The dirty liquid seeps into the grout, ruining an hour of my hard physical labor. Brent stops and throws his head back, laughing loudly so every single investor in the grand lobby can hear him clearly. He gestures toward me with a dismissive, arrogant wave of his manicured hand. He tells the gathered millionaires that I am a pathetic charity case he only tolerates because he married my daughter. He claims he gave me this low-level janitorial job out of the sheer goodness of his heart, just to keep me off the city streets. The investors chuckle politely, adjusting their silk ties and looking at me with pure disgust. I feel a sharp, burning heat rise in my chest, but I swallow my immense pride completely. I do not utter a single word of protest or defense. I do not clench my calloused fists. I reach down, grab the heavy wet mop, and begin soaking up the gray sludge covering the floor. I scrub the marble with methodical, rhythmic motions, completely ignoring the mocking whispers of the wealthy men standing inches from my face. I endure this absolute humiliation with a perfectly blank expression, focusing entirely on the wet stone, while Brent continues to boast loudly about his fabricated generosity to his impressed audience. I let them believe they are infinitely superior to the broken old man kneeling at their expensive feet. I absorb Brent's vicious cruelty without flinching because I desperately need this minimum wage paycheck for a very specific purpose. Every single dollar I earn scrubbing these corporate floors is immediately funneled to an elite private investigator. 35 years ago, my life was shattered into unrecognizable pieces. My 3-year-old son Jamari was brutally kidnapped from our very own front yard in the middle of a sunny Tuesday afternoon. The devastating ransom demands completely ruined my highly successful architecture firm, stripping away everything I had built, but the ruthless kidnappers never returned my little boy. The local police eventually closed the case, calling it a tragic, unsolved criminal mystery, but a loving father never stopped searching for his flesh and blood. That desperate, relentless hunt consumes every ounce of my energy and every dollar I pretend to have to my name. I intentionally present myself to the world as a broke, exhausted delivery driver and janitor to remain entirely invisible. I take on grueling, humiliating night shifts to fund the underground search operations without drawing any unwanted attention to my actual financial status. I let arrogant men like Brent treat me like absolute garbage because pride is a useless luxury when you are hunting for a ghost. My only priority is finding Jamari. I pay informants, hire forensic data analysts, and chase down every rumor, no matter how faint or remarkably expensive. I endure the back-breaking labor and the constant disrespect because every floor I mop buys me another vital hour of active investigation time. Brent thinks his petty insults diminish me, but he has no idea what kind of fierce protective fire burns beneath my silent exterior. The painful, vivid memories of my missing son drive me forward, transforming my quiet suffering into a focused, unbreakable weapon. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of high heels echoes across the marble lobby, cutting through the loud laughter of Brent's wealthy investors. My daughter Aaliyah strides out of the adjacent glass elevator wearing a designer dress that costs more than my annual janitorial salary. She stops abruptly, taking in the humiliating scene playing out near the security desk. She sees her husband standing over me with a smug grin while I kneel on the wet stone, wringing out a filthy mop. I look up, hoping to catch a flicker of empathy or defense in my own child's eyes. Instead, Aaliyah glares at me with a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. She does not reprimand Brent for his cruel behavior. She does not offer to help her elderly father up from the cold floor. She crosses her arms tightly over her chest and wrinkles her nose in deep disgust. She coldly orders me to pack up my cleaning supplies and use the hidden service elevator in the back hallway. She states sharply that my presence in the main lobby is embarrassing her in front of important business partners. Her harsh words sting worse than any insult Brent could ever deliver, cutting straight through my chest like a physical blade. I look at the daughter. I raise the child I protected and provided for all my life, and see only a stranger corrupted entirely by greed and status. I push myself up from the marble floor, gripping the wooden handle of the mop to steady my aching knees. I lock eyes with her for a long, heavy moment, silently absorbing the absolute betrayal in her gaze. I do not argue or plead for basic respect. I just nod, silently turn my back on them, and drag the heavy bucket toward the service corridor. I arrived at the heavily gated iron entrance of the sprawling suburban mansion exactly at 6 p.m. for the mandatory Sunday dinner. Brent and Aaliyah lived in a massive stone estate that felt more like a fortress than a home. The heavy oak front door swung open before I could even ring the bell. Aaliyah stood in the foyer wearing a crisp white dress. She did not offer a hug or a warm greeting. She simply turned her back and coldly ordered me to take my boots off before stepping onto her imported hardwood floors. I complied in total silence and followed her into the cavernous dining room. The atmosphere inside the house was instantly suffocating and deeply hostile. Brent sat at the far end of a long glass dining table, swirling a glass of expensive red wine with a look of supreme arrogance. He did not bother to stand or shake my hand. A single plate sat at the opposite end of the table, isolated and uninviting. I slowly and carefully took my seat, placing my hands on my lap. There was absolutely no food served. There were no pleasantries exchanged about my week or my health. Instead of passing a warm meal, my daughter reached down to the floor and retrieved a thick, heavy black legal binder. She slammed it down very hard onto the glass surface. She forcefully slid the binder across the long dining table until it crashed directly onto my empty porcelain plate. I looked down at the thick stack of legal papers resting aggressively on my empty plate. Aaliyah leaned forward and rested her sharp elbows on the clear glass table. She firmly demanded I sign over the entire deed to my historic city brownstone immediately. She pointed a sharp, manicured fingernail at the blank signature line on the top page. She stated clearly that I was too old and entirely too poor to maintain such a valuable piece of prime real estate. Brent took a slow, arrogant sip of his expensive red wine and finally decided to speak. He proudly announced that his corporate development firm absolutely required my land to finalize a massive commercial construction project. He boldly explained his deeply ambitious plan to bulldoze the entire historic neighborhood and replace it with a highly profitable luxury shopping complex. He told me the local city council had already quietly approved the preliminary zoning permits for his shiny new high-rise building. He cruelly claimed my old brownstone was nothing more than an ugly roadblock standing directly in the way of his immense future wealth. He demanded I stop acting like a stubborn old fool and surrender the valuable property without a tedious legal fight. I looked directly into his cold blue eyes and then shifted my steady gaze to my own flesh and blood sitting right next to him. I forcefully pushed the heavy black binder back across the glass table. I firmly stated my answer was an absolute and final no. I refused to surrender my home instantly and without a single ounce of hesitation. I told them both that my beautiful historic brownstone was completely off the open market and would never be sold to anyone under any circumstances whatsoever today or tomorrow for any price point ever. I maintained my firm, proud posture and explained exactly why that specific piece of highly valuable property meant absolutely everything to me. I stated clearly that my missing boy left his little blue nursery on the second floor of that house 35 years ago. I told them his small wooden bed remains exactly as it was on that horrible Tuesday afternoon when he was brutally taken from our front yard. I explained that I keep his vintage toy trains perfectly lined up on the windowsill waiting for his eventual return. I solemnly vowed that I will never sell the final place my beautiful son slept safely before the evil kidnappers stole him away from my loving arms. I explained that the house is not just a building made of bricks and mortar, but a sacred monument to the family I lost. Brent let out a cruel, condescending sneer that echoed loudly across the cold dining room. He slammed his wine glass down onto the table and told me the boy is completely dead. He ruthlessly stated that holding onto a missing ghost for 3 long decades is a pathetic mental sickness that proves I am entirely unfit to manage my own affairs. He told me I was living in a ridiculous fantasy world while actively destroying a multi-million-dollar real estate deal because of pure emotional weakness. He demanded I stop endlessly embarrassing my successful daughter with my relentless, pathetic obsession over a frozen cold case the local police abandoned many years ago. He leaned forward and whispered that the past is dead and buried forever and ever without any hope of a return. He stated I needed to wake up to reality today. I simply stared at him while my heart burned fiercely inside my chest. The dinner was finally over. Aaliyah stood up from her expensive leather dining chair and glared down at me with absolute fury blazing in her dark eyes. She slammed her hand flat against the legal binder to emphasize her final warning. She viciously threatened to file a strict medical mandate with the county court first thing tomorrow morning. She promised to have me officially evaluated by a state psychiatrist to declare me completely legally incompetent to manage my own finances. She stated clearly that she was tired of waiting for me to die naturally. She stared right through me and swore she would forcefully commit me to a cheap state-run medical facility if I dared to ruin their highly lucrative multi-million-dollar business deal. She told me I had exactly 24 hours to sign the property transfer deed, or she would take the entire house by absolute brute legal force. I looked at the little girl I had raised from birth and realized she was completely dead to me now. I did not raise my voice or attempt to argue with her cruel, ungrateful ultimatum. I simply pushed my empty dining chair back and stood up slowly from the glass table. I adjusted my worn coat and turned my back on both of them without speaking a single defensive word. I walked out of the massive dining room and headed straight for the heavy front door while their angry insults echoed sharply down the long hallway. I stepped out into the freezing night air and walked alone down the long paved driveway toward the dark street. I left that hostile suburban mansion in total and absolute silence, knowing the true battle had just officially begun tonight forever. I knew I must prepare a trap immediately right now. I walked down my familiar street the very next afternoon, feeling the heavy weight of the previous night settling deep into my aching bones. I expected to find the quiet solace of my historic brownstone waiting for me. Instead, I found a chaotic construction zone occupying my private property. A massive yellow excavator idled loudly in the center of my front yard, tearing deep, brutal gashes into the manicured lawn I had maintained for over 4 decades. 3 burly men in bright neon safety vests and hard hats drove long steel rods directly into the earth to extract deep soil samples. They operated heavy industrial machinery on my personal land without a single ounce of legal permission or prior warning. The deafening roar of diesel engines completely shattered the peaceful silence of the historic neighborhood. Dust and debris completely covered the stone steps leading up to my heavy oak front door. My beautiful rose bushes were crushed under the muddy treads of the massive tractor. I stood on the cracked concrete sidewalk, completely paralyzed by the sheer audacity of the violent scene unfolding right in front of my own eyes. They were actively destroying my property while I still held the legal deed firmly in my name. Brent had not even waited 24 hours to execute his ruthless corporate takeover. He had unleashed his private demolition crew to physically intimidate me into rapid submission. I stepped forward to bravely demand they shut the roaring machines down immediately right now. Before I could yell at the trespassing workers to stop digging, I saw Brent standing triumphantly on my front porch. He wore a sharp gray designer suit that contrasted harshly with the filthy construction zone he had maliciously created. He stared down at me with a sickeningly smug grin plastered across his face. In his manicured hands, he held a severely battered cardboard box that I instantly recognized. A surge of pure, unadulterated panic struck my chest. That specific box contained the most vital and irreplaceable contents of my entire existence. It held 3 entire decades of extensive private investigation files detailing every single desperate attempt to locate my missing boy. It contained hundreds of expensive forensic reports, faded police transcripts, and every handwritten note I ever scribbled during the darkest nights of my grueling search. More importantly, it held the only surviving photograph of 3-year-old Jamari. That single crinkled picture was the only physical proof I had left of my beautiful son before the brutal kidnapping tore him away from my loving arms. Brent lifted the heavy cardboard box high above his head with a cruel, theatrical flourish. He locked his cold blue eyes directly onto mine to ensure I was watching him closely. He walked slowly to the edge of the stone steps and casually tossed my entire life of hard work into a rusted metal dumpster sitting on the curb. The heavy box hit the bottom of the filthy trash bin with a loud, echoing thud that shattered my breaking heart. Dozens of highly sensitive case files spilled out into the rotting garbage, mixing instantly with discarded construction waste. I watched the only visual memory of my innocent child flutter helplessly down into the dark, greasy grime while Brent simply smiled and adjusted his expensive silk tie. Brent slowly walked down the front steps and stood just inches away from my face. He pointed a long, pale finger toward the rusted dumpster containing all my precious, irreplaceable memories. He loudly declared that the past is absolutely nothing but worthless garbage holding back extreme corporate progress. He cruelly stated that wasting 35 years mourning a dead child makes me a weak, completely pathetic old man. He reached into the inner pocket of his expensive tailored jacket and pulled out a cheap, brightly colored glossy paper brochure. He forcefully shoved the flimsy pamphlet directly against my chest until I was forced to grab it. I looked down and saw an advertisement for a terribly run, low-income state nursing facility located on the dangerous outskirts of the city. Brent smiled with genuine malice and explained that my daughter had already successfully filed the medical incompetence paperwork this morning. He told me the local court would rapidly process the mandate without allowing me to fight back. He promised me my old, worn-out bags would be fully packed and removed by this coming Friday afternoon by sheer legal force. He swore he would personally summon an armed police escort to physically drag me out of my own house if I stubbornly refused to leave quietly. He declared that my beautiful historic property officially belonged to his corporate development empire now, and there was absolutely nothing a broke janitor could ever do to stop him. He turned around and walked away without showing any remorse. He barked loud orders at his construction crew to continue ripping up the front yard immediately. He climbed into his black luxury vehicle parked illegally on the street. The heavy tires screeched against the asphalt as he sped off, leaving me entirely alone right now. I did not shout at the retreating black vehicle. I did not shed a single tear over the devastating loss of my irreplaceable investigative files. I ignored the roaring machines tearing my beautiful garden apart. I walked slowly across the cracked concrete sidewalk and approached the rusted metal dumpster sitting firmly on the curb. The stench of rotting garbage hit my face instantly. I calmly stepped over the high metal rim and lowered myself directly into the filthy container. I waded through discarded food wrappers, broken glass bottles, and heavy industrial construction waste without feeling a single ounce of disgust. My entire focus was completely locked on a small patch of greasy grime near the back corner. I dropped to my knees in the disgusting mess and carefully brushed away a layer of wet newspaper. I reached down into the terrible filth and gently retrieved the tiny, faded photograph of my beautiful 3-year-old boy. The delicate edges were slightly damp, but Jamari's innocent, smiling face remained perfectly intact. I carefully wiped the toxic grime off the crinkled surface using the soft fabric of my jacket sleeve. I held the sacred picture tightly against my rapidly beating heart. I climbed out of the filthy dumpster and walked slowly back up the stone steps. I completely ignored the loud construction crew actively destroying my front lawn. I stepped inside the quiet safety of my historic brownstone and firmly closed the heavy wooden door behind my back. I slid the thick brass deadbolt securely into place, locking the cruel outside world away completely. A deep, unshakable calm washed over my tired bones. The loud, emotional pleading was officially over forever. I walked into the dark hallway holding his picture, knowing exactly what I must do next. The silent adjustment officially begins. I woke up the very next morning with an entirely new perspective. I decided right then and there that I would no longer play the role of the helpless, broken victim for anyone ever again. I needed a completely neutral space away from the suffocating memories of my house to formulate a coherent plan of attack. I walked 3 long blocks in the biting morning cold to a worn-out 24-hour diner that smelled strongly of burnt bacon and stale cigarette smoke. I slid into a cracked red vinyl booth near the back emergency exit. I ordered a simple cup of scalding hot black coffee and placed it directly in front of me without taking a single sip. I reached into the inner breast pocket of my heavy wool coat and pulled out the tiny crinkled photograph of my beautiful missing boy. I smoothed out the delicate damp edges using the flat, calloused palms of both my hands. I placed the picture carefully onto the scratched Formica table and simply stared at his innocent, smiling face. The relentless, chaotic noise of the busy diner completely faded away into absolute silence. The aggressive clanking of heavy porcelain plates and the loud yelling from the busy kitchen completely disappeared from my conscious awareness. I sat there completely frozen in time, mentally reviewing every single step I needed to take to absolutely destroy Brent's corrupt corporate empire today. A tall, broad-shouldered man wearing an impeccably tailored dark navy suit walked briskly into the noisy diner. He bypassed the busy host stand entirely and marched directly toward my isolated back booth without a single second of hesitation. He slid into the cracked red vinyl seat directly across from me, moving with a smooth, aggressive confidence that demanded instant, total attention. He looked down at the crinkled, faded photograph resting quietly on the scratched Formica table. He leaned forward, invading my personal space, and asked in a low, dangerously calm voice if I was truly still actively searching for that specific little boy. My heart instantly hammered violently against my aching ribs. I slowly raised my head and locked my eyes directly onto his cold, calculating gaze. I demanded to know exactly who he was and why he was asking me such an incredibly deeply personal question right now. I completely ignored his expensive suit and focused entirely on the sheer intensity burning brightly in his dark brown eyes. I told him he had exactly 10 seconds to explain himself before I called the local police to report extreme harassment. He did not blink or show any fear. He simply reached inside his expensive tailored jacket and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. He dropped the massive file directly onto the sticky Formica table with a loud, resounding thud that completely rattled my cold coffee cup. He tapped a strong, manicured finger directly onto the thick, heavy manila envelope. He stated clearly that he possessed absolute concrete proof regarding exactly who orchestrated the brutal kidnapping of my beautiful, innocent child 35 long years ago. He promised that the comprehensive, detailed contents of that specific file would completely destroy everything I thought I knew about my entire tragic life. I stared down at the thick document, feeling a sudden massive wave of pure, unadulterated terror crash violently over my tense, exhausted body. I demanded to know exactly how a completely random stranger could possibly possess highly classified criminal information that a dozen expensive private investigators could never find. He leaned even closer across the sticky table until his intense face was merely inches away from my own. He explained that he was a senior investigative auditor who spent the last 12 years relentlessly tracking an extremely complex maze of illegal offshore shell companies. He stated that those specific hidden financial accounts were secretly established entirely to launder the massive bloody ransom money paid during that horrible Tuesday afternoon. He firmly declared that the ruthless men who ruined my highly successful architecture firm were completely exposed within those very pages. I demanded to know exactly why an elite corporate auditor would care about a cold, forgotten kidnapping case from 3 decades ago. I asked him what his actual motivation was right now today. The stranger slowly unbuttoned his expensive tailored jacket and sat back against the cracked red vinyl booth. He looked directly into my wide, terrified eyes and let out a long, heavy sigh. He pointed a strong, steady finger directly at the tiny, crinkled, faded photograph resting quietly on the scratched table. He stated in a voice that was both incredibly soft and devastatingly powerful that his legal name was Jamari. He told me he was the exact same little boy smiling brightly in that specific 35-year-old picture. The busy diner around us completely vanished into an absolute suffocating vacuum. The scalding hot coffee sitting directly in front of me suddenly felt like pure heavy ice. The air was violently sucked entirely out of my lungs in a single massive agonizing rush. I stared completely paralyzed at the strong, handsome adult man sitting right across from me, desperately searching for any recognizable trace of my beautiful lost child. I looked closely at the distinctive shape of his dark brown eyes and the strong, familiar line of his square jaw. I realized with absolute, undeniable certainty that he was telling me the complete, absolute truth right now today. My beautiful, innocent, missing son had finally returned home to me after 35 long years of agonizing, brutal silence. The silent adjustment shifted immediately into pure, unadulterated, aggressive corporate warfare. I stared at the sharply dressed man sitting across from me in the worn diner booth. My entire body trembled violently under the crushing weight of his impossible claim. I refused to let blind hope override my logical senses after 35 years of devastating dead ends. I slammed my calloused hands flat against the sticky Formica table and demanded absolute, irrefutable proof. I told him I would not tolerate a cruel scam designed to exploit a grieving father. The man did not flinch or break eye contact. He reached into his thick manila envelope and pulled out a crisp white document bearing the official seal of a top-tier genetic testing laboratory. He slid the heavy medical paper across the table directly into my trembling hands. I picked up the report and immediately scanned the densely printed text looking for the final conclusion. My eyes locked onto the bold black letters at the very bottom of the page. The genetic match was absolutely flawless, confirming a 99.9% probability of a biological father and son relationship. I read the numbers over and over again until the printed ink began to blur. The medical science was completely indisputable and legally binding. The adult stranger sitting perfectly still in this quiet diner was undeniably my own flesh and blood. The crushing, heavy void that had consumed my entire adult life suddenly snapped completely shut right now today. I placed the paper down and looked at my son, Jamari. We shared a brief and incredibly heavy moment of profound emotional realization right there in the dimly lit diner. A massive surge of pure relief flooded my weary soul as I finally saw the adult version of the little boy I had desperately hunted for decades. However, we both instantly recognized that we absolutely could not afford to break down crying in public. There was an intense, dangerous energy radiating from the remaining documents scattered across the table. I swallowed the thick lump forming in my throat and forced my overwhelming emotions into a cold, rigid lockbox. I wiped my eyes quickly and nodded for him to continue his urgent presentation. Jamari mirrored my disciplined posture and efficiently opened the primary forensic file resting between our coffee cups. He smoothly adopted a highly professional tone to explain his current position and immense resources. He revealed that he currently operates as a senior investigative auditor for a massive international private equity firm. His daily corporate life revolves around ruthlessly dissecting fraudulent financial records and tracking illegal hidden assets across the entire globe. He possessed the exact high-level security clearances and forensic accounting tools necessary to unearth the darkest corporate secrets. He methodically spread dozens of highly complex bank statements and redacted wire transfer logs across the sticky Formica surface. He tapped a shiny silver pen against a specific highlighted offshore account number to draw my total attention. He stated that he had successfully utilized his elite auditing position to quietly reopen his own kidnapping case. He explained that the local police had failed 35 years ago because they followed the physical evidence instead of following the massive flow of illicit cash. Jamari had decided to hunt the actual ransom money I had paid to save his innocent life today. Jamari traced the enormous sum of ransom money I paid 35 years ago through a remarkably complex and highly illegal maze of offshore shell companies. He explained that the brutal kidnappers were actually professional corporate mercenaries hired to execute a highly specific financial strike against my thriving architecture firm. I listened in absolute horrified silence as he laid out the undeniable paper trail proving the kidnapping was never a random act of street violence. It was a calculated business strategy designed to drain my entire liquid fortune and force my company into sudden, devastating bankruptcy. Jamari pointed his silver pen at the final destination of the laundered money printed clearly on the very last banking document. The illicit funds were quietly transferred directly into a private, untraceable trust account completely controlled by Brent's late father. A sickening wave of profound disgust and blinding rage surged violently through my entire body. Brent's father was my fiercest and most ruthless real estate competitor 3 decades ago. He was losing massive city contracts to my superior architecture firm and faced total financial ruin. Jamari explained that my enemy orchestrated the abduction to completely destroy my business while simultaneously securing the exact illegal capital required to save his own failing enterprise. Every single luxury tower and high-end commercial complex Brent currently owns was directly funded by the blood money extorted during my son's horrific kidnapping. Brent's entire pristine family empire was built entirely on the deep, agonizing trauma inflicted upon my innocent child. The sheer magnitude of this generational evil completely staggered my mind. I stared at the irrefutable banking records showing how my own stolen wealth had directly financed the very same arrogant man who currently torments me every single day. The bitter irony felt like a physical blow to my chest. Jamari revealed an even darker layer to this twisted nightmare as he closed the heavy file. He stated that Brent explicitly discovered this deeply buried family secret exactly 1 year ago while conducting an internal corporate audit. Brent realized that the original kidnapping financial records were actually buried inside a secure vault hidden within the heavy concrete foundation of my historic brownstone. He knew that if those highly illegal documents were ever exposed, his entire corporate empire would be instantly dismantled and seized by federal authorities. Jamari explained that Brent strategically married my daughter Aaliyah, purely as a calculated legal maneuver to gain absolute control over my final remaining asset. Brent never actually loved Aaliyah, or cared about our family in any genuine capacity. His entire marriage was a cold, calculated business transaction designed exclusively to acquire my specific property and completely obliterate the damning criminal evidence hidden beneath my floorboards. That is the exact reason Brent is so incredibly desperate to bulldoze my beautiful home and pour fresh concrete over the entire neighborhood. He is actively trying to pave over his father's horrific sins before anyone can uncover the undeniable truth. A deep, terrifyingly cold clarity completely washed over my tense, weary body. I looked across the table at the brilliant, brave son I had lost and suddenly felt an overwhelming surge of pure, dangerous energy. My profound grief instantly transformed into a highly focused, unbreakable weapon. I realized that crying over the past was entirely useless when the true enemy was currently plotting against me. I told Jamari that we absolutely must strike back against this corrupt, arrogant monster immediately, without showing a single ounce of mercy. I grabbed my freezing cold coffee cup and firmly finalized our silent, ruthless corporate strategy right here, right now, today, forever. Jamari leaned across the sticky Formica table and quickly opened a heavily redacted secondary file folder. He smoothly spread a brand new series of complex banking ledgers directly in front of my face. He stated clearly that Brent currently projects the flawless public image of an untouchable real estate billionaire. He pointed a sharp, manicured finger at a column of bold red numbers highlighting a completely different and devastating reality. Brent is entirely broke. His massive corporate empire is currently drowning in a lethal ocean of toxic commercial debt. Jamari explained that Brent leveraged his entire company against a series of high-risk luxury developments that failed spectacularly over the past 2 years. The aggressive inflation rates and severe market shifts completely decimated his liquid capital overnight. Brent is frantically moving money between dozens of empty shell companies just to cover his minimum monthly operating expenses. His luxurious suburban mansion and fleet of expensive black vehicles are entirely financed by predatory secondary lenders charging astronomical interest rates. He is wearing the incredibly expensive mask of a highly successful mogul to hide the terrifying truth from his elite investors. Jamari tapped the table and declared that Brent is currently bleeding cash at an unprecedented and totally unsustainable speed. The untouchable billionaire is actually a desperate drowning man frantically treading water in a dark abyss of impending financial ruin. I stared down at the concrete proof of my cruel son-in-law's absolute failure and felt a deep, powerful sense of righteous, absolute satisfaction. Jamari flipped to the next page of the highly classified dossier and explained the exact mechanics of the impending corporate collapse. He stated that Brent is aggressively pursuing a massive commercial bailout loan from a deeply exclusive private equity firm to completely erase his crippling debts. However, the extremely strict lending committee requires a massive influx of prime tangible collateral before they will even consider approving the massive $90 million cash injection. Brent currently possesses absolutely zero valuable liquid assets to legally pledge against the enormous financial lifeline. Jamari revealed that my historic city brownstone sits squarely in the geographic center of a highly coveted commercial zoning district. My perfectly located property represents the absolute missing cornerstone of a massively lucrative real estate development package. Brent desperately needs my exact parcel of land to finalize the sprawling blueprint and successfully secure the massive private equity bailout loan immediately. Jamari stated with absolute certainty that if Brent does not legally acquire the deed to my brownstone by the very end of this current calendar month, his entire corrupted company faces complete and total foreclosure. The The relentless secondary lenders will aggressively seize every single physical building and frozen bank account associated with his name. Brent is backed entirely into a dark, inescapable corner with absolutely zero alternative options remaining on the corporate table. He requires my signature to survive the upcoming financial slaughter. Every single cruel insult and violent threat he hurls at my face is directly fueled by the ticking countdown of his impending total destruction. He is not a powerful corporate titan executing a brilliant business maneuver today. He is a pathetic, terrified animal completely trapped in a cage of his very own making. I smiled coldly, understanding the raw leverage I truly possessed right here, right now, today. I drank the cold black coffee and processed the massive strategic implications of this incredible revelation immediately. I completely understood that Brent's extreme arrogance is purely a desperate smokescreen designed to hide his sheer, unadulterated panic. Jamari leaned forward and exposed the absolute darkest layer of this entire generational conspiracy. He stated that Brent does not merely want my valuable land to build a profitable commercial shopping complex today. He intends to aggressively bulldoze my historic brownstone to completely destroy the deeply hidden financial records his wicked father physically buried directly inside my deep concrete foundation 35 years ago. My blood ran completely cold as the horrific reality of the situation fully materialized in my brain. After the brutal kidnapping successfully ruined my original architecture firm, the predatory rival completely renovated the adjacent properties and maliciously utilized my own basement structure to conceal his sprawling, illegal offshore ledgers. Brent knows with absolute certainty that if the aggressive secondary lenders foreclose on my specific property, they will inevitably discover the incredibly massive paper trail linking his pristine family empire directly to the bloody ransom money. He is completely terrified that a thorough, independent corporate audit will instantly obliterate his false reputation and send him directly to federal prison for extreme financial fraud. The frantic rush to seize my deed and bulldoze my beloved family home is solely driven by his desperate need to physically eradicate the highly illegal buried evidence before the impending bankruptcy proceedings commence. He requires my prompt surrender to simultaneously secure the $90 million private equity bailout loan and completely annihilate the last surviving proof of his father's heinous crimes against my innocent family. I looked directly into the dark brown eyes of my brave surviving son and nodded slowly. We knew how to break him. Jamari and I sat perfectly still in the quiet diner and swiftly formulated a highly ruthless corporate trap together. I listened intently as my brilliant son outlined the exceptionally precise legal and financial maneuvers required to completely dismantle Brent's crumbling empire from the inside out. We absolutely needed to maintain the illusion of my total weakness to prevent Brent from acting unpredictably before the snare officially snapped shut. Jamari explained that I must immediately return to my historic brownstone and actively pretend to be a completely broken and entirely defeated old man. I must convincingly feed Brent's vastly inflated ego and heavily nurture his dangerous false confidence over the next few agonizing days. I nodded firmly and promised to play the subservient victim flawlessly without showing a single trace of my newly discovered immense power. I stated that Brent expects me to cower in fear while his private contractors aggressively destroy my precious front yard. I will give him exactly the pathetic submission he desperately craves to keep him utterly blind to our impending lethal strike. Jamari packed the thick manila folder back into his sleek leather briefcase and handed me a small encrypted burner phone for strictly secure communications moving forward. He squeezed my calloused hand tightly across the sticky table, solidifying our newly forged unbreakable alliance. I walked out of the diner into the freezing morning air, feeling an incredibly dangerous sense of pure, lethal purpose, completely replacing my decades of quiet sorrow. The agonizing search was finally over, and the beautiful, silent adjustment was now fully operational. I headed straight toward my brownstone, knowing perfectly well that Brent's absolute destruction was mathematically guaranteed. He foolishly awakened a highly dangerous and very patient monster today. I will make him absolutely pay for every single tear I ever shed. I sat in the dim light of my kitchen and stared at the encrypted burner phone Jamari had provided. I dialed a highly secure number I had memorized over 2 decades ago. Harvey answered on the second ring with his usual crisp professionalism. I did not exchange any pleasantries or waste a single breath on small talk. I instructed my trusted attorney to immediately draft a comprehensive corporate ambush designed to completely paralyze Brent's impending private equity bailout. I commanded Harvey to legally restructure the entire deed to my historic brownstone overnight. I explicitly ordered him to embed devastating poison pill clauses deep within the property transfer contracts. These specific legal traps would automatically trigger a massive catastrophic financial penalty if any hostile entity attempted to seize or bulldoze the land. I told Harvey to construct a labyrinth of airtight legal barriers that would completely blindside Brent's aggressive corporate lawyers. Harvey listened in total silence and understood the gravity of my unyielding tone. He did not ask any questions about my sudden aggressive shift in strategy. He simply promised to have the weaponized documents finalized and fully notarized before the end of the week. I hung up the secure phone and felt a profound sense of tactical control. The legal snare was now officially set and waiting in the shadows. I knew that Brent's insatiable greed would blind him to the lethal traps hidden within the fine print. The time for passive defense had permanently ended. I was now actively hunting the monster who built his pristine empire on my deepest, agonizing grief. The very next morning, I clocked into my grueling shift as a lowly janitor at Brent's massive glass and steel corporate headquarters. I strapped on my faded blue uniform and gripped the heavy wooden handle of my industrial mop. I completely embraced the pathetic, subservient role Brent desperately needed me to play. I shuffled through the expansive marble lobby with my shoulders heavily slumped and my head bowed in total defeat. I made sure every single arrogant executive walking past me saw nothing but a broken, exhausted old man entirely crushed by the brutal weight of the world. Brent marched through the polished atrium flanked by his usual entourage of aggressive corporate lawyers. He spotted me emptying a metal trash receptacle near the golden elevator banks and smirked with sickening, absolute triumph. He purposefully detoured from his path and walked directly over to my service cart. He maliciously kicked my yellow plastic mop bucket, spilling dirty, soapy water across the pristine marble floor. He loudly commanded me to clean up the pathetic mess immediately and reminded me that my termination was swiftly approaching. I did not clench my fists or lock my jaw in defiance. I did not allow a single spark of the burning rage inside my chest to reach my tired eyes. I simply nodded obediently and dropped to my aching knees with a dirty rag. I aggressively scrubbed the wet marble while he laughed cruelly with his sycophants. Every mocking chuckle only sharpened my silent, deadly focus. I swallowed my immense pride and fed his dangerous, false confidence perfectly. I knew his extreme, blinding arrogance was his absolute greatest vulnerability today. I played the weak, frightened victim flawlessly, ensuring he never suspected the lethal trap quietly closing around his throat right now. Midnight finally arrived and the towering corporate headquarters emptied out completely, leaving me entirely alone on the executive floor. I pushed my squeaking janitorial cart down the dark, silent hallway toward Brent's sprawling private boardroom. My subservient shuffle instantly vanished, replaced by a sharp, highly calculated stride. Brent fundamentally underestimated who he had employed to clean his pristine floors. He completely forgot that long before the kidnapping destroyed my life, I was the premier commercial architect in this entire city. I actually designed the original structural framework of this exact high-rise building 35 years ago before his wicked father aggressively orchestrated the hostile takeover. I knew every single hidden ventilation shaft, electrical conduit, and blind spot within this massive glass tower. I had flawlessly memorized the original intricate blueprints decades ago, and those structural details remained perfectly burned into my mind. I approached the heavy frosted glass doors of the boardroom and purposefully positioned my cleaning cart to entirely block the primary hallway security camera. I utilized the exact blind spots I purposefully engineered into the ceiling corners back when I drafted the initial security schematics. I slipped the master access key I had secretly duplicated into the electronic lock. The heavy doors clicked open smoothly, allowing me to step inside the expansive executive sanctuary undetected. The sprawling room was dominated by a massive, polished mahogany conference table where Brent ruthlessly finalized his corrupt acquisitions. I stood in the dark, silent room, breathing in the expensive leather and stale corporate greed. I knew this was the exact location where Brent was aggressively plotting the total destruction of my historic brownstone and the finalized massive private equity bailout loan. I approached the long wooden table, moving with complete, absolute silence in the dark. I reached deep into the hidden pocket of my faded blue uniform and retrieved the tiny piece of specialized equipment Jamari had discreetly provided. It was a sophisticated military-grade micro-recording device perfectly designed to capture highly sensitive audio with crystal-clear, absolute precision. The black rectangular device was no larger than a common postage stamp and completely undetectable to standard commercial bug-sweeping equipment. I dropped to my knees on the plush imported carpet and crawled underneath the massive mahogany conference table. I carefully navigated the thick wooden support beams and located the absolute perfect acoustic placement directly beneath Brent's customary leather chair. I peeled the industrial adhesive backing off the tiny device and pressed it firmly against the rough unfinished wood hidden completely out of sight. I held it there for 10 seconds, ensuring the powerful chemical bond gripped the mahogany flawlessly. I pressed the microscopic activation button hidden on the side of the tiny black casing. A microscopic green light blinked twice in the darkness, confirming the secure encrypted transmission signal was officially live and directly routed to Jamari's untraceable offshore servers. I crawled backward out from underneath the heavy wooden table and stood up slowly in the dark boardroom. Every single confidential conversation, ruthless corporate threat, and illegal financial negotiation Brent conducted in this room would now be instantly captured and permanently recorded. I stepped out of the executive sanctuary and quietly locked the heavy frosted glass doors behind my back. I grabbed the wooden handle of my industrial mop and resumed my pathetic, subservient shuffle down the long hallway. The definitive evidence required to completely obliterate Brent's corrupt empire was now actively collecting in the dark. I pushed my cleaning cart toward the golden elevators, knowing the final brutal phase of my retaliation was officially in motion. I sat in my worn leather armchair, staring at the heavy oak front door of my historic brownstone. The polished brass bell chimed brightly, completely breaking the heavy silence of the early afternoon. I shuffled slowly toward the entryway, intentionally dragging my feet to mimic the pathetic physical decline my cruel daughter aggressively expected to see today. I unlocked the heavy deadbolt and pulled the door open to find Aaliyah standing on my front porch holding a large basket of expensive gourmet fruit. She wore a sharp-tailored cream suit that looked entirely out of place in my quiet, historic neighborhood. She immediately forced a sickeningly sweet smile onto her face and threw her arms around my stiff shoulders in a completely artificial embrace. She walked past me into the dimly lit hallway, setting her extravagant gift basket down on the antique console table with a theatrical sigh of deep exhaustion. She turned around and looked at me with wide eyes full of completely fabricated concern regarding my rapidly declining physical health. She softly stated that she had been terribly worried about me living completely alone in such an enormous, drafty house. She claimed her sudden, unexpected visit was driven entirely by pure, daughterly affection and a deep, pressing need to ensure I was properly cared for during my fragile twilight years. I stared directly into her dark eyes, recognizing the absolute cold calculation hiding just beneath her flawless, pristine makeup. I nodded weakly, playing my required subservient role perfectly. Aaliyah guided me toward the heavy wooden dining table and pulled out a chair with exaggerated care. She sat directly across from me and unclasped her designer briefcase, pulling out a thick stack of dense legal documents. She placed a silver pen on top of the crisp white pages and pushed them smoothly across the polished wood. She leaned forward and explained in a remarkably soothing voice that these specific papers were absolutely essential upgrades to my current comprehensive health insurance policy. She told me Brent had personally used his vast corporate connections to secure me a premium lifetime medical package that would cover every single future hospital expense I might eventually incur. She insisted that all I needed to do was sign the bottom of the pages to guarantee my complete physical safety and financial security moving forward. I looked down at the dense legal text and immediately recognized the highly specific formatting of municipal real estate transfer contracts. My decades of running a premier architecture firm taught me exactly how to read complex property deeds and binding asset forfeiture clauses. Aaliyah had maliciously layered a fake generic health insurance cover letter directly over the binding legal paperwork that would instantly sign my historic brownstone over to Brent's failing corporate empire. She was actively attempting to steal my vastly valuable land right out from under me using a disgusting facade of genuine medical concern. I felt a massive surge of pure boiling rage ignite deep within my chest, but I kept my physical posture completely hunched and thoroughly defeated. I stared blankly at the complex legal jargon, intentionally letting my jaw drop slightly to simulate severe cognitive confusion. I knew she was banking entirely on my supposed mental incompetence to execute this brazen daylight robbery without facing resistance today. I purposefully allowed my hands to tremble violently as I slowly reached out to pick up the expensive silver pen resting on the table. I muttered a series of disjointed, nonsensical sentences about my failing memory and my aching joints to completely solidify the pathetic illusion of my rapid mental decline. I looked up at Aaliyah with wide, fearful eyes and asked her to remind me exactly what day of the week it was right now. A terrifying flash of pure, absolute disgust crossed her pristine features for a split second before she forced the sickeningly sweet smile back onto her face. She gently patted my trembling hand and told me not to worry my tired old head about the complex, confusing details today. She simply pointed her sharp, manicured fingernail at the blank signature line waiting patiently at the very bottom of the final page. I knew exactly how crucial it was to legally invalidate this corrupt contract without triggering her immediate suspicion. During the earliest days of my grueling architecture career, I severely broke my right wrist on a dangerous construction site, forcing me to draft complex blueprints entirely with my non-dominant left hand. I spent 6 agonizing months perfecting a completely different fluid signature style that looked entirely authentic but possessed distinct, undeniable structural variations. I clumsily transferred the silver pen from my dominant right hand over to my weaker left hand while letting out a heavy, exhausted sigh. I pressed the metal tip against the crisp white paper and deliberately executed my specialized alternate signature across the dotted black line. I purposefully dragged the expensive pen slowly across the page, creating jagged, uneven ink strokes that mirrored the pathetic physical weakness she expected to see while secretly ensuring the entire legal document was fundamentally flawed. That highly intentional and deeply calculated alteration completely and permanently invalidates the entire fraudulent property transfer without a single shadow of a legal doubt. Any competent forensic handwriting expert would instantly testify under absolute federal oath that the jagged ink marks on that specific contract do not match my established financial records whatsoever. Aaliyah snatched the signed documents right off the mahogany dining table the very second I lifted the silver pen away from the paper. She swiftly shoved the vital paperwork deep inside her designer briefcase and snapped the golden locks shut with a loud, resounding click of ultimate victory. She did not bother offering me a final hug or maintaining her sickening facade of daughterly affection for a single moment longer. She simply stood up, smoothed out the wrinkles in her tailored cream skirt, and marched triumphantly toward the heavy oak front door without looking back once. She genuinely believed she had successfully stolen my vastly valuable historic brownstone to save her husband's failing corporate empire today. I walked slowly over to the living room window and pulled the heavy velvet curtains back just an inch to quietly observe her departure. She stood on the concrete sidewalk, bathed in pale afternoon sunlight, pulling her sleek smartphone out of her designer purse with eager, frantic hands. She rapidly dialed Brent's personal number and held the phone tightly against her ear, smiling with pure, absolute malice. I watched her lips move clearly as she joyfully celebrated her massive criminal victory, openly declaring that my estate was finally legally theirs forever. I stood alone in the dark, quiet room, smiling coldly back at her retreating figure. She was enthusiastically delivering the completely worthless fraudulent documents directly into the waiting jaws of our devastating corporate snare. Their absolute destruction was complete now. I pushed my heavy janitorial cart into Brent's sprawling corporate boardroom late Wednesday night. The high-rise tower was completely deserted, leaving me entirely alone in the suffocating silence. I slid underneath the massive mahogany conference table and carefully peeled the military-grade micro-recording device off the rough wooden beam. The tiny green activation light blinked steadily, confirming it had successfully captured days of highly classified conversations. I dropped the tiny black square directly into the deep pocket of my faded blue uniform and finished mopping the pristine marble floors without altering my slow, subservient shuffle. The next morning, I traveled to the heavily guarded downtown financial district to meet with my son and my trusted attorney. Harvey had secured a soundproof, windowless conference room deep inside his private legal firm to ensure absolute operational secrecy. Jamari sat at the head of the dark oak table, connecting the microscopic recording device to his encrypted offshore laptop. Harvey stood by the locked steel door, holding a fresh legal notepad with a look of grim determination. I sat between them, staring at the glowing blue progress bar on the computer screen. We did not exchange any polite morning pleasantries or waste time discussing the weather outside. We simply waited in heavy silence for the digital audio files to finish decrypting. Jamari tapped the keyboard, and the crystal-clear sound of Brent's arrogant voice suddenly echoed through the secure room. The ultimate revelation of my daughter's absolute betrayal was about to officially begin. The high-definition audio feed captured the clinking of expensive crystal glasses and the booming laughter of several ruthless corporate executives. Brent proudly held court at the head of his mahogany table, boasting about his latest flawless legal maneuver. He loudly mocked my pathetic trembling hands and my supposed rapid mental decline. He bragged to his sycophantic board members that he had successfully scammed a stupid broken old man out of a highly coveted historic property worth tens of millions of dollars. He explicitly detailed how he used a fake health insurance document to completely steal my final remaining asset right out from under my blind eyes. The executives roared with cruel appreciative laughter, completely unaware that the very property deed Brent held was entirely invalidated by my alternate left-handed signature. The heavy boardroom doors clicked open on the recording, instantly silencing the boisterous corporate celebration. The sharp clicking of designer high heels echoed distinctly across the imported plush carpet. Aaliyah's smooth, confident voice broke through the digital static, demanding an immediate update on the property transfer status. Brent happily informed his wife that the legal acquisition was officially complete and her father was scheduled for permanent removal by Friday afternoon. He complained that dealing with a stubborn, confused old janitor was becoming incredibly tedious and asked if the state mandate was fully approved by the local judge. Aaliyah let out a cold, dismissive sigh that chilled the blood running through my veins. She casually told her husband to stop worrying about a weak, obsolete old fool who no longer served any viable purpose to their expanding empire. She assured him she had already devised a highly effective physical solution to ensure my rapid departure from the historic brownstone. I leaned closer to the laptop speakers as my own flesh and blood calmly outlined a deeply disturbing physical assault against me. Aaliyah instructed Brent to completely cancel the armed police escort he had previously threatened to summon. She explained that a violent public eviction on the front lawn of the historic brownstone would draw massive, unwanted media attention and severely damage their pristine corporate reputation before the private equity bailout loan was officially finalized. She stated that I was deeply terrified of state medical facilities after watching my late wife slowly succumb to a devastating terminal illness in a cold, sterile hospital room over 2 decades ago. Aaliyah ruthlessly weaponized her intimate knowledge of my deepest psychological trauma to craft her cruel strategy. She coldly suggested completely bypassing my inevitable emotional resistance by simply crushing a massive dose of highly restricted prescription sedatives directly into my evening tea. She detailed exactly how she would visit my house under the fake guise of a final farewell dinner to ensure I ingested the heavy narcotic chemicals. She promised Brent that once the strong medication completely incapacitated my central nervous system, they could quietly carry my unconscious body out the back door under the cover of darkness. They would dump me into the back of a private medical transport van and abandon me at the low-income state nursing facility before I even woke up. She laughed softly into the microphone, entirely proud of her incredibly dark and viciously calculated domestic terrorism. She was actively plotting to heavily drug her own father to secure a corrupt commercial real estate monopoly without facing a single legal consequence. The recording clicked off, leaving a deafening heavy silence hanging thick in the windowless legal office. Harvey slowly lowered his yellow notepad, completely speechless at the sheer calculated malice radiating from his own audio speakers. Jamari stared at the black screen with his jaw locked in pure tight fury, ready to tear Brent's corporate empire to the absolute ground. I sat perfectly still in the leather chair, feeling the very last frayed thread of my paternal love violently snap in half. Any lingering microscopic hesitation I harbored about utterly destroying my daughter's life completely vanished into thin air. The sweet little girl I had raised with every ounce of my soul was officially dead and buried forever. The woman speaking on that digital recording was a ruthless, dangerous predator who actively intended to inflict severe physical harm upon me to secure her vast financial greed. I closed my eyes and completely severed all remaining emotional ties to Aaliyah, instantly turning my breaking heart into a cold, impenetrable fortress of solid stone. I opened my eyes and looked directly at my trusted attorney and my fiercely loyal son. I declared that the time for passive observation and defensive positioning was permanently over right now. The quiet, patient adjustment period officially shifted into an aggressive, merciless campaign of pure, devastating corporate warfare. I instructed Harvey to immediately execute the aggressive poison pill traps embedded deep within the property transfer documents. I commanded Jamari to initiate the catastrophic financial protocols that would instantly trigger Brent's massive toxic debt defaults. We were going to trap them inside their own burning house. The final brutal snare was fully armed, and I was ready to watch them fall. Jamari leaned heavily against the edge of the dark oak conference table and crossed his strong arms over his chest. He watched Harvey rapidly type the complex legal commands to activate the poison pill clauses, but a deep shadow of intense strategic concern quickly crossed my son's face. He bluntly interrupted the furious typing to highlight a massive, glaring vulnerability in our immediate battle plan. Jamari stated clearly that triggering a total corporate war against a desperate billionaire requires an immense amount of liquid capital. He reminded me that Brent currently retains an entire army of vicious, high-priced corporate defense attorneys who specialize in burying their opponents under mountains of endless, expensive litigation. Jamari warned me that his private equity firm absolutely cannot legally front the exorbitant personal legal fees required to fiercely defend my historic brownstone in a prolonged federal court battle. He explained that while triggering the toxic debt default will severely cripple Brent financially, the desperate monster will undoubtedly use his remaining corporate credit lines to launch a scorched earth legal campaign against my property deed. Jamari looked at my faded blue janitorial uniform and stated with gentle but firm realism that my meager hourly wages simply cannot sustain a multi-million-dollar legal defense. He believed we were stepping onto a brutal battlefield without the necessary financial ammunition to survive the first wave of incoming artillery. I smiled warmly at my son and raised my calloused hand to halt his completely justified panic. I simply told them both to follow me right now. I led Jamari and Harvey out of the secure legal office and directed them toward the absolute center of the bustling downtown financial district. We walked briskly through the freezing morning winds until we reached the towering, polished steel doors of the most exclusive and highly secured private banking institution in the entire city. Jamari shot me a look of deep, profound confusion as I casually bypassed the standard civilian teller lines and walked directly toward the heavily guarded elite client elevators. An armed security director wearing a crisp black suit immediately recognized my face and respectfully swiped a solid gold access card to grant us immediate entry into the subterranean vaults. The heavy, reinforced steel elevator plummeted deep beneath the bustling city streets, delivering us into a completely silent, temperature-controlled corridor lined with massive titanium safety deposit boxes. We stepped into a private, brightly lit viewing room completely isolated from the outside world. I instructed the bank director to immediately retrieve my primary financial dossier, and he quickly returned carrying a thick, leather-bound portfolio. I sat at the polished glass table and looked directly into the bewildered eyes of my brilliant son. I explained that when Brent's wicked father aggressively orchestrated the hostile takeover and completely ruined my thriving architecture firm 35 years ago, everyone genuinely believed I was utterly defeated. They assumed my devastating emotional grief and sudden severe poverty permanently broke my spirit, forcing me into a pathetic life of subservient manual labor. I stared deeply into Jamari's eyes and stated clearly that I never actually stopped working a single day in my entire life. I simply shifted my operations completely into the dark shadows where my greedy enemies would never think to look for me. I opened the heavy leather portfolio and slid the crisp official banking ledgers directly across the cold glass table toward my son. I explained that I intentionally embraced the pathetic, invisible persona of a broken minimum wage janitor to completely vanish from their wealthy corporate radar. I lived like an absolute pauper in the dusty, forgotten corners of my historic brownstone, eating cheap canned food and wearing threadbare secondhand clothing for over 3 decades. I entirely sacrificed every single ounce of personal comfort and modern luxury to quietly hoard every single penny I ever earned. I never bought a new vehicle or took a single vacation. I actively channeled every dime of my meager janitorial salary and the small remaining fragments of my liquidated architecture assets into a highly aggressive, perfectly hidden international stock portfolio. I spent my lonely, sleepless nights ruthlessly studying global market trends and executing incredibly complex financial trades under a secure, anonymous corporate proxy. I operated a massive silent investment empire from a cheap plastic folding table in my dark basement, while Brent arrogantly walked right past me every morning. Jamari stared down at the official certified bank statements resting on the table and let out a sharp gasp of pure, absolute shock. Harvey leaned over his shoulder and his jaw physically dropped open as he read the final bold, black numbers printed at the bottom of the page. The flawlessly verified offshore banking balance clearly displayed exactly $22 million in completely clean, highly liquid cash. I had quietly amassed a massive, untouchable fortune right under the noses of the very men who stole my life. I watched the profound realization wash over my son as he finally understood the true sheer magnitude of my lifelong silent dedication. I placed my calloused hands flat against the cool glass table and leaned forward with a look of pure, unyielding authority. I stated clearly that the pathetic broke old janitor sweeping Brent's pristine marble floors was nothing more than a meticulously crafted illusion designed to breed absolute fatal overconfidence. I am an incredibly wealthy, heavily armed adversary who has spent 35 years patiently preparing for this exact decisive battle. I turned my sharp focus directly toward Harvey and issued my next strict legal command. I officially authorized my trusted attorney to immediately liquidate $7 million of my hidden offshore assets today. I instructed him to rapidly funnel that massive sum of liquid cash completely untraceably directly into Jamari's elite private equity firm through a series of secure proxy accounts. This massive, instantaneous financial injection would provide my son with the exact unlimited ammunition he required to aggressively buy up Brent's toxic secondary debt notes before the afternoon trading markets officially closed. I looked into Jamari's dark brown eyes and saw the fierce, brilliant spark of a true corporate predator instantly ignite. He recognized immediately that by quietly purchasing his enemy's toxic debt, he would suddenly become Brent's primary unyielding creditor. We were not simply going to fight Brent in a tedious, drawn-out courtroom battle. We were going to aggressively choke off his financial air supply and legally seize his entire corrupt empire from the top down. I closed the heavy leather portfolio and stood up from the glass table, feeling a massive surge of pure lethal adrenaline coursing through my old veins. The financial trap was fully loaded and ready to completely snap Brent's neck. I told my son it was finally time to go hunting. We left the subterranean vault and traveled straight to Jamari's sleek corporate office located on the top floor of a glass skyscraper overlooking the financial district. The sprawling executive suite was a stark contrast to the dark underground bunker where my hidden fortune had slept for decades. Jamari immediately went to work behind his massive tempered glass desk and initiated the devastating financial protocols. He utilized his elite private equity firm as an impenetrable corporate shield to legally conceal my identity from the public markets and the prying eyes of Brent's aggressive legal team. He systematically deployed the massive $7 million cash injection I had just authorized to aggressively target Brent's deeply exposed financial liabilities. Over the next 6 grueling hours, Jamari executed a series of ruthless, highly coordinated acquisitions across multiple secondary lending markets. He systematically bought up every single toxic commercial loan and high-interest promissory note that Brent had desperately leveraged against his failing real estate empire over the past 2 agonizing years. Jamari moved with the lethal precision of an apex predator, completely surrounding its prey before the final fatal strike. By late afternoon, my son had successfully consolidated the fragmented ocean of toxic corporate debt into one single massive, inescapable financial block completely controlled by our anonymous offshore proxy. The aggressive corporate snare was now fully constructed and securely locked into place, ready to be triggered at my exact command. I sat in the leather chair across from Jamari and watched the final encrypted confirmation illuminate his computer screen. I was now officially Brent's sole unyielding creditor, and I held the absolute legal power to instantly trigger a catastrophic total default on his entire crumbling empire. Brent remained utterly, completely oblivious to the massive, lethal shift in the corporate landscape shifting directly beneath his expensive Italian leather shoes. He genuinely believed that Aaliyah had successfully executed her sickening medical deception and legally secured the vital deed to my historic brownstone earlier that very afternoon. Armed with that dangerous false confidence, Brent immediately marched into his executive boardroom and proudly signed the official commercial demolition orders. He blindly authorized his private contractors to violently bulldoze my deeply beloved family home into a pile of shattered brick and splintered wood the following morning. He completely ignored standard municipal waiting periods and arrogantly bypassed the necessary environmental zoning permits. He was entirely driven by a desperate, frantic need to physically eradicate the highly illegal buried financial evidence hidden deep inside my concrete foundation before any impending bankruptcy audits could possibly commence. He commanded his heavy construction crews to bring the massive diesel excavators onto my front lawn at the very break of dawn. Brent genuinely thought he had finally won the grueling generational war his wicked father had started 35 years ago. He possessed absolutely zero comprehension that the very property transfer contract he proudly held in his greedy hands was legally worthless and fundamentally flawed by my highly calculated alternate signature. He was actively marching blindly into a lethal trap of his own making, celebrating a victory that would rapidly transform into his ultimate absolute demise. He foolishly trusted his deceitful wife to handle the execution of his grand scheme, never realizing her arrogance had provided me the exact opening required to sabotage the entire legal framework. Brent's massive, blinding arrogance pushed him to make a series of incredibly reckless, fatal miscalculations in the immediate aftermath of his supposed victory. He falsely believed the acquisition of my highly coveted commercial zoning parcel would instantly guarantee the massive $90 million private equity bailout he desperately needed to survive. Acting on that completely fabricated assumption, he immediately rushed to a predatory tertiary lender and aggressively borrowed another $500,000 using my stolen property deed as direct tangible collateral. He did not use this massive influx of fresh cash to pay down his crippling operational debts or cover his severely delinquent corporate payroll obligations. Instead, he maliciously funneled every single penny into funding an incredibly lavish, sprawling corporate gala to publicly celebrate his monumental new commercial development project. He rented out the grand ballroom of the most expensive luxury hotel in the entire downtown district and invited hundreds of the wealthiest elite investors in the city to witness his grand, triumphant resurgence. This extreme, deeply narcissistic behavior was the exact same toxic pathology that completely destroyed his wicked father's original corporate empire decades ago. The old man had aggressively embezzled the bloody ransom money from my kidnapped firm to fund a series of massive, extravagant public displays of false wealth, completely draining his actual liquid capital until the federal authorities finally closed in. Brent was perfectly repeating the exact same destructive generational cycle of unadulterated greed and profound public vanity. He was actively throwing a massive, expensive party to celebrate a fraudulent corporate victory using stolen money he did not actually possess, while completely ignoring the massive lethal debt crisis actively strangling his own neck. He was entirely consumed by the desperate need to project an untouchable image of supreme success to his wealthy peers, blinding himself to the cold, hard reality that his entire lavish lifestyle was precariously balanced on a single forged document. Harvey walked briskly into Jamari's office carrying a thick, sealed manila envelope containing the ultimate legal counterstrike. While Brent was busy renting crystal chandeliers and ordering imported champagne for his extravagant corporate gala, my brilliant attorney was aggressively maneuvering through the dark corridors of the federal judicial system. Harvey slammed the envelope down on the glass desk and proudly announced he had successfully secured an immediate ironclad federal injunction completely blocking any physical demolition of my historic brownstone. He presented the presiding federal judge with indisputable forensic proof that the jagged ink marks on the property transfer contract Aaliyah had stolen were a complete intentional forgery. The aggressive legal injunction legally barred Brent's construction crews from stepping a single foot onto my property under the explicit threat of immediate mandatory federal imprisonment. Jamari and I reviewed the binding legal documents and formulated the absolute perfect moment to drop the lethal guillotine directly onto Brent's neck. We deliberately chose not to serve the devastating federal injunction or the catastrophic debt default notices to his corporate headquarters during standard business hours. We completely agreed that Brent and Aaliyah deeply deserved to experience the exact same excruciating public humiliation they had callously inflicted upon my innocent family for decades. We decided to wait silently in the shadows until Friday night, when the massive grand ballroom was completely packed with hundreds of their wealthy elite peers. We were going to let Brent proudly stand on a brightly lit stage and boast about his brilliant fraudulent achievements before we utterly annihilated his entire corrupted world. The silent strategy was completely armed, and the beautiful destruction was officially guaranteed. I stared at the sealed federal documents, knowing the final reckoning was now only hours away. The freezing Friday morning air carried the heavy rumble of diesel engines directly to my front door. Brent completely ignored the massive legal storm gathering silently above his head and chose to aggressively act on his completely fraudulent property contract. He dispatched a fleet of massive moving trucks and a crew of deeply intimidating private contractors to forcefully physically evict me from my historic brownstone. The heavy oak front door violently swung open before I even had the chance to turn the deadbolt. 4 massive men wearing dark, unbranded uniforms barged directly into my quiet entryway, carrying heavy crowbars and thick rolls of industrial packing tape. They completely bypassed any standard legal pleasantries and immediately began ripping my antique furniture away from the walls. Brent purposefully hired the most aggressive and unsympathetic eviction crew available in the city to ensure my swift and brutal removal. They shouted harsh commands at each other and carelessly shattered a beautiful ceramic vase that my late wife bought during our very first anniversary trip. They completely stripped the quiet dignity from my home in a matter of minutes. I stood quietly in the main hallway, observing their aggressive destruction without offering a single word of protest. Brent desperately needed this rapid physical clearance to maintain his fragile timeline for the massive corporate gala he was hosting later tonight. He genuinely believed his brute force tactics would completely crush my spirit and secure his stolen real estate empire permanently. Aaliyah stepped gracefully through the shattered remains of my front entryway, clutching a sleek silver clipboard against her pristine designer coat. She marched directly onto my wooden porch and stood amongst the violent chaos with an expression of pure, absolute triumph. She pointed a manicured finger toward the busy street corner where a rusted white medical transport van sat idling heavily in the morning shadows. She stated in a remarkably cold and completely emotionless tone that the state nursing facility was actively waiting to process my permanent admission. She demanded I immediately gather my pathetic, meager belongings and walk out the front door before her contractors physically dragged me across the concrete pavement. I watched her perfectly manicured eyes scan the living room as the aggressive movers aggressively ripped my worn clothing out of my bedroom closets. They violently shoved my faded shirts and frayed trousers directly into thick black plastic trash bags like common household garbage. Aaliyah did not flinch or show a single ounce of daughterly remorse as the brutal men carelessly tossed the heavy plastic bags directly onto the damp front lawn. She simply tapped her expensive pen against her silver clipboard, actively checking off boxes on her cruel logistical schedule. She viewed my entire lifetime of memories and quiet sacrifices as nothing more than a minor administrative hurdle to clear before she could properly attend her husband's lavish evening gala. Her profound lack of human empathy was completely chilling to witness firsthand. She watched the ruthless destruction of my historic home with the detached satisfaction of a predator successfully isolating its weak, wounded prey. I knew her icy confidence was completely built upon a foundation of absolute lies, but I played my final subservient role with flawless, absolute perfection. I did not raise my voice or clench my fists in righteous anger as the aggressive men continued their violent purge of my family home. I completely suppressed the blazing inferno of pure rage burning deep within my chest and forced my shoulders to slump into a posture of absolute total defeat. 35 years ago, when the initial corporate kidnapping completely obliterated my thriving architecture firm, I made the devastating mistake of fighting back openly against my powerful enemies. I actively yelled and threatened Brent's wicked father, allowing my raw emotional desperation to blind my strategic judgment. That youthful arrogance directly resulted in my immediate financial ruin and my forced exile into the invisible working-class shadows. I fundamentally learned during those long decades of silent, grueling janitorial labor that true power requires absolute emotional discipline. I purposefully let my eyes turn dull and vacant, completely stripping away any trace of the sharp, multi-millionaire predator hiding just beneath the surface. I slowly reached into the deep pocket of my faded blue trousers and pulled out the heavy brass keys to the historic brownstone. My hands trembled violently as I extended my arm and surrendered the cold metal ring directly into Aaliyah's eagerly waiting palm. I muttered a weak, pathetic apology for causing her so much unnecessary trouble and actively shuffled my feet across the wooden floorboards. She snatched the brass keys with a sharp, triumphant smirk, genuinely believing she had completely shattered my final remaining ounce of human dignity. I executed the performance of a completely broken, senile old man, flawlessly ensuring she never suspected the massive federal injunction and the catastrophic debt defaults waiting to completely annihilate her pristine reality. I quietly shuffled down the wooden porch stairs, leaving my treacherous daughter behind to revel in her beautiful temporary victory. Aaliyah confidently turned her back on me and immediately began issuing loud, authoritative commands to her aggressive demolition crew. She fundamentally assumed I would submissively shuffle down the cracked concrete sidewalk and climb directly into the back of the waiting, rusted medical transport van. I walked slowly past the discarded black trash bags scattered across my damp front lawn, keeping my head bowed until I completely cleared her line of sight. I did not walk toward the miserable state nursing facility vehicle waiting at the street corner. I sharply altered my trajectory and walked briskly down the narrow side alleyway, moving with immediate lethal precision. A sleek, heavily armored black town car sat silently idling in the shadows of the adjacent brick building, perfectly concealed from the busy main street. I grasped the polished chrome handle and slid smoothly into the luxurious leather interior. Harvey sat behind the steering wheel wearing a sharp, tailored midnight blue suit and gripping a thick leather briefcase containing the weaponized federal documents. He locked the heavy reinforced doors and accelerated smoothly away from my historic brownstone, completely leaving the pathetic illusion of the broken old janitor behind, forever. Jamari was already waiting downtown, coordinating the final devastating blow against Brent's crumbling financial empire from his secure offshore servers. The trap was now fully closed, and the agonizing wait was officially over. I leaned back against the plush leather seat and watched the towering glass skyscrapers of the financial district rapidly approaching through the tinted windows. We were heading directly to the grand ballroom of the luxury hotel to crash the most lavish corporate gala of the entire decade. The time for silent adjustments had officially ended, and the time for pure, unadulterated, absolute destruction was finally here. The sleek black town car glided through the bustling downtown streets and smoothly pulled to a halt just a block away from the magnificent Grand Imperial Hotel. Through the tinted windows, I could clearly see the brilliant searchlights sweeping across the night sky and illuminating the ornate stone facade of the historic building. Brent had spared absolutely no expense in funding this lavish corporate smokescreen. He actively transformed the expansive main ballroom into a breathtaking spectacle of extreme unearned wealth. The massive room was heavily decorated with imported white orchids and towering crystal centerpieces that caught the bright flashes of the rolling local news cameras. The city mayor stood near the grand entrance, heartily shaking hands with a densely packed crowd of elite commercial investors and wealthy socialites. Brent had successfully gathered the absolute highest echelon of the city's financial and political power brokers into one single room to witness his triumphant resurgence. They eagerly drank his expensive imported champagne, completely unaware that the luxurious celebration was entirely financed by predatory high-interest loans leveraged against my stolen property deed. The sheer magnitude of the public spectacle was deeply nauseating, but it perfectly set the stage for my impending strike. The more aggressively he inflated his magnificent public image tonight, the more devastating his inevitable catastrophic fall would be. I waited silently in the comfortable leather seat of the town car, watching the wealthy guests filter through the gilded hotel doors. Harvey checked his silver pocket watch and nodded sharply, signaling that the perfect moment to completely dismantle Brent's fraudulent empire was rapidly approaching. Inside the sprawling ballroom, Aaliyah glided effortlessly through the dense crowd of wealthy elites, projecting the flawless image of a highly successful corporate matriarch. She was draped in a breathtaking emerald green evening gown and wore a heavy, sparkling diamond necklace that rested coldly against her collarbone. Those magnificent jewels were not purchased with legitimately earned corporate profits, but were directly financed by the massive offshore credit lines Brent had recklessly secured using my historic brownstone as fraudulent collateral. She laughed brightly with the mayor's wife, completely unbothered by the horrific fact that she had ruthlessly ordered my violent physical eviction mere hours earlier. The soft classical music playing over the premium sound system gradually faded away as Brent confidently stepped up to the polished glass podium positioned at the absolute center of the grand ballroom. He tapped the microphone with a manicured finger and instantly commanded the total attention of the silent captive audience. Brent delivered a highly rehearsed, aggressively arrogant speech detailing his grand visionary plans for the city's commercial future. He boasted loudly about his pristine family legacy, completely ignoring the dark, undeniable truth that his wicked father had built their entire empire using the bloody ransom money stolen from my violently kidnapped firm decades ago. He spoke with immense, profound pride about honor, integrity, and the uncompromising dedication required to reshape the municipal skyline. He actively painted himself as a brilliant, unyielding titan of industry, single-handedly rescuing the local economy from stagnation. Every single word spilling from his smiling lips was a calculated, disgusting lie designed to completely pacify his nervous investors and secure the massive private equity bailout he desperately required to survive the week. I listened to the live audio feed transmitting directly into the town car, feeling my cold, absolute resolve harden into pure steel. Brent signaled gracefully to his sycophantic executive team, and two men quickly rolled a massive table onto the brightly lit stage. The object resting on the wood was entirely concealed beneath a thick, black velvet drape. Brent leaned into the microphone and proudly announced that his company had officially secured the final missing cornerstone required to complete his sprawling commercial masterpiece. He firmly grabbed the edge of the velvet fabric and pulled it back with a dramatic sweeping flourish to reveal a breathtaking, highly detailed architectural model of a towering glass and steel commercial high-rise. The miniature skyscraper was absolutely magnificent, but my eyes instantly zeroed in on the precise geographic location the massive building was designed to occupy. The sprawling modern structure was explicitly positioned directly on top of the exact foundation where my deeply beloved historic brownstone currently stood. He was actively showcasing the absolute physical erasure of my family history to a room full of cheering, ignorant strangers. The crowd of wealthy elite investors erupted into wild, thunderous applause, completely captivated by the sheer immense scale of the highly lucrative development project. Flashbulbs erupted in a blinding, continuous wave as the rolling news cameras captured Brent smiling victoriously beside the miniature glass tower. The painful irony of the moment was completely staggering to witness. Brent was actively taking public credit for an architectural vision while simultaneously planning to violently bulldoze the very same deep concrete foundation where his father had physically buried the highly illegal offshore ledgers, tying their pristine family name directly to my kidnapping 35 years ago. He desperately needed that massive new high-rise to permanently entomb the hidden bloody evidence of his father's heinous crimes forever. The deafening applause continued to echo through the grand ballroom, completely validating his dangerous narcissistic delusions of supreme corporate invincibility. The thunderous applause echoing throughout the grand ballroom began to slowly subside as Brent confidently raised his hands to gracefully accept the overwhelming adoration of his wealthy peers. He opened his mouth to deliver his final triumphant remarks, completely believing he had successfully outmaneuvered his crippling debt and permanently destroyed my life in a single brutal day. Harvey smoothly shifted the sleek black town car into drive and pulled aggressively up to the main hotel entrance, entirely ignoring the frantic shouting of the bewildered valet attendants. I stepped out of the vehicle and straightened my dark tailored suit, moving with the sharp, undeniable authority of a true apex predator. I walked briskly through the opulent hotel lobby, flanked by Harvey and Jamari, moving with perfect, lethal synchronization. We bypassed the busy registration desks and marched directly toward the massive, heavy brass doors guarding the main event space. I did not pause or offer a single polite word of explanation to the armed private security guard stationed outside the ballroom. I firmly gripped the ornate brass handles with both of my calloused hands and shoved the heavy doors violently forward with every ounce of my physical strength. The massive doors swung inward and slammed aggressively against the interior marble walls with a deafening, catastrophic crash that instantly shattered the elegant atmosphere. The soft, triumphant music playing over the speakers abruptly stopped dead in its tracks, leaving a thick, suffocating silence completely paralyzing the massive room. Hundreds of elite investors, powerful city officials, and rolling news cameras all turned simultaneously in absolute total shock. They stared directly at the grand entryway, completely mesmerized by the sudden, violent disruption. I stood perfectly still, framed entirely by the glowing hallway lights, staring directly across the silent ballroom into the terrified wide eyes of my treacherous son-in-law. The final corporate slaughter had officially arrived. I strode deliberately into the sprawling epicenter of the grand ballroom as the deafening echo of the shattered brass doors resonated through the high vaulted ceiling. The absolute total shock radiating from the hundreds of elite guests parted the dense crowd like a physical wave. I did not shuffle or bow my head in pathetic subservience. The faded blue janitorial uniform that had carefully disguised my existence for 3 agonizing years was gone completely. I wore a flawless, custom-tailored charcoal suit woven from the finest imported wool. The sharp, aggressive cut of the dark fabric perfectly mirrored the lethal corporate predator I had silently become. My polished leather shoes struck the pristine marble floor with a heavy, rhythmic certainty that demanded immediate, absolute attention. The wealthy investors and powerful city officials stared in utter bewilderment at the sudden, imposing transformation. They expected to see a broken, trembling old man trespassing on their exclusive celebration. They instead witnessed a hardened commercial titan stepping directly out of the deep shadows and reclaiming his rightful territory. The glittering crystal chandeliers cast a harsh, illuminating light across my face, exposing the cold, unyielding steel burning deeply within my eyes. I kept my posture rigidly upright and my shoulders squared, projecting an immense physical authority that completely dominated the opulent space. Every single whispering voice in the grand room instantly died in my wake. The air grew thick and heavy with impending absolute destruction. Jamari marched flawlessly and stepped directly on my right side, projecting the aggressive, lethal energy of an apex corporate shark completely unbound by his usual restraint. Harvey flanked me tightly on my left, carrying the thick leather briefcase containing our devastating legal ammunition. We formed an impenetrable human wedge, advancing relentlessly toward the brightly lit stage at the far end of the grand ballroom. Brent gripped the edges of the polished glass podium so hard his knuckles turned completely white under the intense stage lights. The smug, arrogant smirk that had dominated his face just seconds ago instantly melted away, leaving a mask of pure, terrified panic. All the color rapidly drained from his perfectly tanned cheeks as he recognized the lethal, undeniable truth marching directly toward his throat. Aaliyah stood frozen beside the massive architectural model, gripping her stolen diamond necklace with trembling hands as the terrifying reality of my presence completely shattered her pristine delusion. Brent wildly slapped his hand against the sensitive microphone, sending a sharp, piercing feedback whine echoing painfully through the silent crowd. He leaned desperately into the podium and aggressively screamed for his private security detail to immediately intervene. He loudly commanded the armed guards to physically remove the trespassing, senile old man from his private corporate gala. His voice cracked with a pathetic, undeniable terror that completely stripped away his carefully cultivated image of absolute invincibility. He frantically pointed his trembling finger at my chest, demanding swift, violent action to protect his fraudulent empire from total annihilation. His desperate public meltdown perfectly exposed the weak, terrified animal hiding just beneath his expensive Italian suit. He was actively begging for salvation from a reckoning he could no longer escape. 6 massive armed security guards immediately detached themselves from the perimeter walls and charged aggressively toward the center of the ballroom. They moved with the brutal, coordinated efficiency of men who were highly paid to eliminate physical threats without asking a single question. Their heavy combat boots pounded against the polished marble floor as they rapidly closed the physical distance between our advancing formation and the main stage. They fully intended to forcefully tackle me to the ground and violently drag my body out into the freezing night air exactly as Brent fiercely commanded. Before the lead guard could lay a single violent hand on my charcoal suit, Harvey smoothly stepped directly into his immediate path. My brilliant attorney did not flinch or show a single ounce of physical fear in the face of the massive rushing men. Harvey calmly reached into his tailored midnight blue jacket and produced the thick, sealed federal document with absolute icy precision. He forcefully pressed the crisp white paperwork directly against the chest of the imposing head of security, halting the aggressive charge entirely. The commanding guard looked down and instantly recognized the distinct, bold typography of the highest judicial authority in the entire state. Harvey sharply informed the towering man that any physical contact with my person would immediately constitute a severe federal crime punishable by an automatic mandatory prison sentence. He clearly stated that the aggressive demolition orders Brent had proudly brandished were entirely fraudulent and completely legally void. This precise legal counterstrike was built on decades of patiently studying the exact ruthless tactics Brent's father utilized to steal my original architecture firm. I learned exactly how to weaponize the rigid federal court system against the very predators who historically manipulated it to destroy innocent lives. The head of security aggressively snatched the federal injunction from Harvey's hand and rapidly scanned the dense legal text. His hardened eyes locked instantly onto the massive red judicial seal and the undeniable binding signature of the presiding federal judge. The massive guard completely understood the catastrophic legal implications of defying a direct federal order in front of hundreds of rolling news cameras. He sharply raised his right fist into the air, issuing a silent, immediate command to his aggressive tactical team. The 5 remaining armed guards instantly halted their violent advance and took 3 deliberate steps backward, entirely clearing my path. They completely refused to lay a single physical finger on me, choosing their own legal preservation over Brent's frantic, screaming commands. Brent watched his highly paid private army completely stand down and abandon him to the slaughter. His desperate shouts echoed uselessly through the silent ballroom, as the ultimate realization of his total defenselessness rapidly settled into his panicked brain. I completely ignored his pathetic, trembling figure and resumed my deliberate, relentless march directly up the carpeted stairs of the main stage. Aaliyah scrambled backward in absolute terror, dropping her silver clipboard onto the wooden floorboards as I breached their highly restricted perimeter. I walked directly past the massive, fraudulent architectural model and stepped firmly behind the polished glass podium. Brent physically shrank away from my imposing presence, completely paralyzed by the sheer radiating force of my absolute authority. I reached out and firmly gripped the neck of the cold metal microphone, adjusting it slightly to match my commanding height. I looked out over the sea of silent, terrified elite investors and prepared to utterly obliterate Brent's corrupt reality with a single devastating breath. I stepped up to the polished glass podium and looked down at the terrified man who had just tried to erase my existence. Brent stood frozen in a pathetic state of shock, completely unable to formulate a single coherent word as I smoothly bypassed his trembling figure. I did not waste a second acknowledging his presence. I reached directly into the tailored inner pocket of my charcoal suit and extracted my secure encrypted smartphone. The grand ballroom remained trapped in a suffocating silence as I swiftly connected my device directly into the master auxiliary port of the hotel's sophisticated audiovisual projection system. Brent had meticulously rigged this entire stage to showcase his magnificent architectural model and broadcast his triumphant corporate ascendance to the wealthy elite. He had unwittingly provided me with the absolute perfect technological weapon to publicly execute his total destruction. I tapped the sleek glass screen of my phone with a single deliberate motion, instantly hijacking the massive digital display hanging directly behind the stage. The towering high-definition screen flickered brightly and immediately projected a crisp, highly magnified image of the disputed commercial property deed for every single elite investor and city official to clearly witness. The blinding white light of the official document completely washed over the bewildered audience, casting harsh shadows across the opulent crystal centerpieces. The trap I had patiently spent 3 agonizing years building in the dark shadows was now actively snapping shut under the brightest lights in the entire financial district. I adjusted the cold metal microphone and let my deep, commanding voice completely dominate the sprawling acoustic space of the grand ballroom. I directed the captive attention of the wealthy audience straight toward the towering digital screen and explicitly instructed them to examine the final authorization line located at the absolute bottom of the projected legal document. I utilized my phone to actively highlight the jagged black ink marks surrounding my supposed signature, blowing the image up to an inescapable massive scale. I stated with absolute unwavering clarity that the sprawling multi-million-dollar commercial development project they were all gathered here to celebrate was entirely built upon a foundation of blatant criminal fraud. I explained that the intricate signature adorning the vital property transfer contract was a meticulously documented intentional forgery designed to actively trigger a massive federal trap. A collective sharp gasp rippled through the dense crowd of elite investors as the devastating reality of my words began to penetrate their champagne-fueled celebration. I locked my hardened gaze directly onto the flashing red lights of the rolling local news cameras, ensuring my unyielding declaration was permanently recorded for the evening broadcasts. I announced to the entire bewildered city that Brent did not legally own a single inch of the highly coveted downtown commercial zoning parcel he had just proudly claimed as his own. I revealed that his entire extravagant public groundbreaking ceremony was nothing more than a desperate, pathetic illusion, completely funded by stolen corporate capital and illegal predatory debt. The sprawling architectural model resting on the stage suddenly transformed from a symbol of monumental success into a physical monument of his impending catastrophic federal imprisonment. Brent's pristine corporate empire was officially bleeding to death in front of his most vital financial lifelines. The suffocating tension inside the ballroom reached a breaking point as the wealthy investors furiously began whispering among themselves and aggressively checking their ringing mobile phones. Brent desperately lunged forward and violently grabbed the edge of the glass podium, attempting to wrest control of the narrative back from the precipice of total annihilation. He let out a loud, forced laugh that echoed with a sickening artificial bravado through the premium speakers. He frantically waved his sweating hands toward the audience and loudly yelled that they should completely ignore the rambling delusions of a broken old man. He aggressively pointed his finger directly at my chest and boldly declared to the bewildered crowd that his tragic father-in-law suffered from severe, debilitating dementia. Brent callously weaponized the exact same vicious narrative he had meticulously engineered months ago when he secretly paid a corrupt medical professional to actively falsify my cognitive health records. He genuinely believed that by publicly branding me as a confused, senile liability, he could instantly discredit my damning physical evidence and salvage his crumbling $90 million bailout. He desperately tried to paint my flawless corporate sabotage as the tragic, erratic outburst of a rotting, decaying mind completely unfit to manage its own affairs. He screamed that I required immediate emergency medical confinement and begged his private security to intervene. I did not flinch or offer a single defensive argument to counter his pathetic, screaming accusations. I simply stared at his sweating, desperate face with the cold, detached calculation of an executioner pulling a heavy lever. I reached down to my encrypted smartphone resting on the podium and deliberately pressed a single large red button displayed on the glowing screen. The booming sound of Brent's frantic, desperate excuses was instantly overpowered by a sharp digital click echoing through the massive ballroom speakers. The towering projection screen behind us immediately shifted from the forged property deed to a stark black audio waveform pulsating with lethal rhythmic precision. A crystal-clear high-definition audio recording flooded the opulent space, capturing the exact, unmistakable arrogance of Brent's voice perfectly preserved from a hidden microphone I had secretly planted inside his private executive office weeks ago. The entire room fell completely dead silent as the recorded voice of the supposed visionary titan proudly bragged about ruthlessly stealing the historic family estate from an ignorant old janitor. The audio file captured Brent callously detailing his exact meticulous strategy to fraudulently leverage the stolen property deed to secure massive illegal offshore loans. Every single filthy detail of his criminal conspiracy was broadcasted loudly and undeniably directly into the ears of the exact elite investors he was desperately trying to court. A profound collective gasp of pure, utter revulsion tore through the wealthy crowd as they listened to him mock their financial gullibility on the pristine digital recording. The devastating, irrefutable proof completely shattered his final remaining facade of corporate legitimacy. The city mayor, who had been standing proudly near the grand entrance just moments earlier, instantly turned completely white. He immediately recognized the massive, catastrophic political fallout of being publicly associated with a blatant federal criminal conspiracy. He aggressively shoved his way through the dense crowd of panicked socialites and walked briskly out of the heavy brass doors without looking back. Brent was now entirely abandoned, entirely exposed, and completely surrounded by the total devastating ruins of his own unparalleled greed. The deafening silence inside the grand ballroom was violently shattered by Brent's sudden animalistic scream. He physically recoiled from the devastating audio recording echoing across the high-vaulted ceiling, but his deeply ingrained arrogance refused to accept absolute defeat. Brent slammed his sweaty palms against the polished glass podium and practically frothed at the mouth as he pointed a trembling, accusing finger directly at my face. He loudly proclaimed to the whispering crowd of elite investors that the digital recording was a heavily manufactured deepfake designed to extort him. His voice cracked with sheer, absolute desperation as he aggressively threatened to bury me under a mountain of relentless, high-priced corporate litigation. Brent screamed that my pathetic attempt at sabotage was completely irrelevant because his massive commercial development project was fully capitalized by the most ruthless and heavily funded private equity firm in the entire state. He actively boasted that his invincible institutional backers would happily finance an endless legal war to completely crush my ridiculous fraud allegations and secure his permanent ownership of the commercial zoning parcel. He genuinely believed that his massive $90 million corporate credit line was an impenetrable shield that would easily protect him from the catastrophic fallout of his own recorded confessions. He looked wildly around the room, desperately searching the faces of his wealthy peers for a single ounce of validation or support. He stood entirely alone on the brightly lit stage, clinging to the absolute illusion of his borrowed financial power while completely ignoring the lethal predators standing directly in front of him. Brent's frantic screaming echoed off the crystal centerpieces for a few agonizing seconds before Jamari calmly stepped forward from my right side. My son moved with the cold, unyielding grace of an executioner ascending the scaffold, completely ignoring the aggressive posturing of the terrified man behind the podium. Jamari smoothly adjusted the lapels of his custom-tailored suit and firmly grasped the metal neck of the microphone. He looked directly into Brent's wide, panicked eyes and let a sharp, lethal smile cross his face. Jamari introduced himself to the whispering crowd of elite socialites and nervous investors in a deep, commanding voice that completely overpowered Brent's desperate, frantic babbling. He clearly and distinctly announced his official legal title as the primary senior managing partner of the exact same private equity firm Brent was desperately relying upon for his corporate salvation. The color instantly drained completely out of Brent's sweating face as the devastating weight of that simple introduction physically struck him like a massive concrete block. He stared at Jamari in sheer absolute horror, realizing in a fraction of a second that his ultimate financial savior was actually his primary executioner. Aaliyah let out a sharp, audible gasp from the corner of the stage, dropping her hands from her stolen diamond necklace as her perfect, luxurious world actively imploded around her. Jamari completely commanded the massive ballroom, explaining that his firm had aggressively targeted and acquired every single toxic secondary loan and over-leveraged promissory note attached to Brent's failing real estate portfolio. He revealed to the shocked audience that he was not simply a potential investor, but rather the absolute sole owner of Brent's entire fractured commercial empire. The massive institutional shield Brent had just proudly hidden behind was actually the very weapon designed to completely sever his head. Jamari did not allow the terrified room a single moment to process the catastrophic revelation before delivering the final lethal blow. He reached into his dark jacket pocket and withdrew a thick, folded legal document stamped with the heavy red seal of his corporate lending institution. He unfolded the crisp paper and spoke directly into the microphone with a cold, surgical precision. Jamari officially announced the immediate, absolute, and unnegotiable recall of the massive $50 million commercial construction loan that was actively keeping Brent's crumbling company afloat. He explicitly cited multiple severe breaches of their rigid lending contract, including the blatant falsification of physical collateral and the intentional submission of deeply fraudulent property deeds. Jamari's voice remained perfectly level as he publicly accused Brent of committing massive, coordinated criminal wire fraud to secure the initial corporate funding. He explained that Brent's wicked father had utilized the exact same illegal accounting maneuvers decades ago to violently seize my original architecture firm, completely draining its liquid capital to fund his own lavish vanity projects. Jamari made it entirely clear to the listening crowd that this aggressive generational cycle of theft and deception was officially permanently terminated. He demanded the immediate full repayment of the $50 million principal, plus all aggressively compounding high-yield interest penalties before the banking markets opened on Monday morning. He knew with absolute undeniable certainty that Brent did not possess even a tiny fraction of the necessary liquid cash to cover the massive catastrophic demand. The lavish corporate gala he was currently hosting was entirely funded by the very stolen money Jamari was now legally clawing back. The massive corporate noose was pulled completely tight around his neck, severing his financial air supply entirely. Brent stared blankly at the polished marble floor as the terrifying reality of his absolute destruction entirely consumed his mind. He physically swayed behind the glass podium as the massive invisible weight of the $50 million debt crushed his spine. He possessed absolutely no legal defense and no hidden corporate capital to combat the lethal financial strike. His entire carefully fabricated net worth literally evaporated into thin air in front of the wealthiest and most powerful individuals in the entire city. The elite investors who had eagerly drank his imported champagne just moments earlier now looked at him with sheer unadulterated disgust, actively pulling out their phones to rapidly sever their own corporate ties to his toxic, sinking ship. The rolling local news cameras captured every single agonizing second of his profound, catastrophic humiliation, broadcasting his absolute ruin directly into the homes of millions. Brent fully realized that he was not just losing his commercial real estate empire tonight. He was actively facing decades of mandatory federal imprisonment for massive institutional fraud and the theft of my historic property. The towering architectural model resting on the stage next to him no longer represented a grand visionary future but stood as a damning physical monument to his unparalleled blinding greed. His knees violently buckled under the immense psychological pressure, completely giving way beneath his expensive tailored trousers. Brent dropped heavily to the hard wooden stage with a sickening thud, entirely unable to support his own physical weight. He knelt helplessly before the massive digital projection of his own forged signature, completely and utterly destroyed. I looked down at the trembling, broken man sobbing quietly on the stage floor and felt absolutely zero sympathy for the monster who had tried to erase my existence. The generational debt was finally paid in full. Brent dragged himself up from the polished hardwood stage floor with his expensive tailored suit completely wrinkled and soaked in cold sweat. His initial paralyzing shock rapidly mutated into a blind, frantic rage as his mind completely fractured under the immense weight of his absolute financial ruin. He aggressively pointed a trembling finger at Jamari and screamed at the top of his lungs, demanding to know why the senior managing partner of a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm was actively sabotaging his own highly lucrative investments. Brent wildly flailed his arms toward me, standing quietly behind the podium, and hysterically demanded to know why a master of the financial universe would intentionally align himself with a pathetic, senile old janitor. He shrieked that the entire sequence of events made absolutely zero logical sense in the ruthless corporate world and begged the silent room to recognize the sheer absurdity of the situation. He furiously accused Jamari of violating basic fiduciary duties and threatened to drag his elite firm in front of the Federal Financial Regulatory Commission for blatantly illegal market manipulation. Brent was actively clutching at invisible straws, entirely unable to comprehend the massive, invisible architecture of the trap that had just violently snapped his neck. He shouted that I was nothing more than a broken, poverty-stricken fool who swept his marble lobbies and cleaned his corporate restrooms for minimum wage. He demanded a rational explanation for the deliberate destruction of his pristine $90 million commercial development project, completely unaware that the impending answer would entirely shatter his fragile reality into a million jagged pieces. Jamari did not flinch or offer a single defensive remark against the frantic, screaming accusations echoing through the grand ballroom. He simply stared down at the desperate, sweating man with eyes as cold and unforgiving as solid glacier ice. The absolute predatory stillness radiating from my brilliant son instantly silenced the panicked whispers rippling through the dense crowd of elite investors. Jamari slowly raised his encrypted smartphone and executed a second flawless digital command directly into the hotel's sophisticated audiovisual projection system. The towering high-definition screen directly behind the stage instantly shifted away from the fraudulent property deed and illuminated the opulent space with a deeply haunting image from the distant past. A faded 35-year-old missing child poster materialized onto the massive digital display, completely dwarfing the bewildered executives and wealthy socialites standing below. The grainy black and white photograph depicted a bright, smiling young boy with distinct, sharp features and deep, soulful eyes wearing a simple school uniform. Jamari calmly stepped to the absolute center of the brightly lit stage, deliberately aligning his face directly next to the towering projection of the stolen child. The undeniable physical resemblance between the powerful corporate titan standing on the stage and the innocent kidnapped boy on the screen struck the silent audience like a physical blow to the chest. Every single sharp angle of his jaw and deep brown stare matched the faded photograph perfectly. A collective wave of profound realization actively washed over the crowded ballroom as the wealthy guests rapidly connected the devastating visual evidence. Brent physically stumbled backward away from the podium, his jaw dropping open in sheer absolute horror as he stared at the terrifying ghost from his family's darkest buried history. The brilliant corporate predator actively dismantling his entire fraudulent empire was the exact same child his wicked father had violently erased from the world 35 years ago. Jamari gripped the metal microphone stand and officially introduced himself to the paralyzed audience using his true given birth name. He clearly and proudly announced that he was the only legitimate son of Antoine, the very man Brent had just arrogantly dismissed as a pathetic senile janitor. Jamari methodically walked the horrified crowd through the darkest hidden corners of the city's commercial history, completely destroying the pristine illusion of their aristocratic wealth. He flawlessly detailed exactly how Brent's ruthless father had orchestrated the violent kidnapping 3.5 decades ago entirely to completely paralyze my thriving architecture firm during a highly contested downtown zoning battle. He pressed another button on his device and instantly flooded the massive digital screen with a damning sequence of deeply buried offshore banking ledgers and highly classified ransom payment transfers. The irrefutable paper trail clearly tracked the massive illegal funds moving directly from Brent's family holding company into the hands of the violent criminal syndicate hired to steal my only child. Jamari explained with absolute surgical precision how that precise ransom money was subsequently embezzled back into the corrupt corporate accounts to finance the exact same real estate empire Brent was standing upon today. He exposed the sickening truth that every single brick and steel beam of their pristine family legacy was entirely cemented with the stolen blood and unimaginable suffering of an innocent family. Brent violently shook his head back and forth, frantically clutching his chest as he desperately tried to deny the massive, irrefutable mountain of forensic evidence projected brightly above him. Jamari stated with cold, absolute authority that his miraculous survival and subsequent rise to the absolute peak of the financial sector was entirely fueled by a singular, lifelong dedication to utterly destroying the very monsters who stole his childhood. The entire grand ballroom remained completely suffocated by a thick, heavy silence as the sheer magnitude of the generational crime fully registered in the minds of the wealthy elite. Brent desperately looked around the opulent room, frantically searching for a single friendly face or a tiny shred of corporate loyalty to shield him from the impending fallout. He found absolutely nothing but pure disgust and utter revulsion from the very people he had invited to celebrate his magnificent triumph. Jamari smoothly lowered the microphone from his mouth and slowly raised his right arm, pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly toward the heavy brass doors at the far end of the main event space. The heavy doors violently crashed open for the second time tonight, entirely shattered by the synchronized kinetic force of a highly trained federal strike team. 24 heavily armed federal agents clad in dark tactical gear and carrying heavy automatic rifles poured aggressively into the grand ballroom. They moved with terrifying absolute efficiency, immediately locking down all available exits and completely securing the physical perimeter of the luxury hotel. The lead federal agent marched directly down the center aisle, completely ignoring the terrified gasps of the wealthy socialites scattering out of his direct path. He brandished a thick stack of official judicial warrants, actively charging Brent with massive coordinated corporate wire fraud racketeering and the aggressive illegal leveraging of stolen property assets. The flashing red and blue lights of the federal transport vehicles actively illuminated the tall glass windows from the street, completely surrounding the building. Brent let out a pathetic whimpering cry as the heavily armed agents aggressively swarmed the brightly lit stage and violently slammed him face first against the polished hardwood floor. The cold, heavy steel handcuffs loudly clicked shut around his wrists, officially terminating his fraudulent existence and permanently closing the dark, bloody chapter of his family's wicked legacy. The heavy tactical boots of the federal agents echoed sharply against the polished marble as they aggressively dragged Brent's trembling form away from the center stage. The blinding flashes of the local news cameras frantically documented every single pathetic whimper escaping his mouth as his entire fraudulent existence completely collapsed in real time. Aaliyah stood entirely paralyzed near the shattered remains of the velvet-draped architectural model, clutching her stolen diamond necklace with trembling, manicured fingers. She watched the heavily armed strike team systematically lock down the perimeter and instantly realized that her pristine, luxurious reality was permanently terminated. The massive offshore credit lines, the sprawling downtown penthouses, and the exclusive country club memberships were all evaporating into thin air right before her terrified eyes. Her pristine designer gown suddenly looked like a tragic costume draped over a completely cornered animal. Aaliyah frantically scanned the chaotic grand ballroom, searching for any possible avenue of escape from the catastrophic federal sweep rapidly closing in around her. She looked at her husband sobbing pathetically on the floor and immediately calculated that his sinking ship would pull her directly into the deepest trenches of the federal prison system. Her survival instinct aggressively kicked in, overriding any remaining shred of marital loyalty she might have possessed. She realized with chilling clarity that her only remaining lifeline stood quietly behind the glass podium. She actively chose to abandon her ruined husband and aggressively execute a desperate tactical pivot to save her own skin. Aaliyah forcefully pushed her way past the stunned elite investors and ran frantically across the sprawling ballroom floor, completely abandoning her carefully cultivated posture of aristocratic elegance. Her expensive high heels clicked desperately against the marble as she sprinted directly toward the main stage where Jamari and I stood with absolute, unyielding authority. She physically threw herself up the carpeted stairs and violently collapsed onto her knees directly at my polished leather shoes. She deliberately let out a loud, hysterical sob and aggressively wrapped her trembling arms around my legs, burying her tear-stained face into the sharp crease of my charcoal trousers. Aaliyah weaponized her tears with absolute terrifying precision, utilizing the exact same emotional manipulation tactics she had practiced since childhood to actively avoid the severe consequences of her actions. She loudly wailed that she was entirely innocent and completely ignorant of the massive financial crimes actively tearing the room apart. She screamed into the silent ballroom, claiming that Brent was a vicious, controlling monster who had systematically isolated her and forced her to participate in his cruel schemes against her own free will. She looked up at my face with wide, pleading eyes, dramatically swearing that her wicked husband had maliciously manipulated her into signing those fraudulent eviction orders without fully explaining his true dark intentions. She actively painted herself as a helpless, tragic victim trapped in a highly abusive marriage, desperately begging her loving father for immediate forgiveness and desperate sanctuary from the incoming federal agents. She tightened her frantic grip on my suit pants and loudly pleaded for a second chance, completely convinced that my deep, enduring paternal love would automatically blind me to her undeniable, vicious treachery. I looked down at the weeping, trembling woman gripping my legs and felt absolutely zero emotional resonance within my hardened heart. The profound, unconditional love I had actively poured into her entire existence had been completely, violently eradicated the moment she gleefully handed my house keys over to a demolition crew. I did not reach down to gently stroke her hair or offer a single warm word of paternal comfort to soothe her hysterical screaming. I maintained a posture of pure, absolute stone, gazing down at her desperate theatrical performance with the cold, detached, clinical precision of a surgeon. I slowly raised my encrypted smartphone and deliberately pressed a separate bright yellow icon displayed clearly on the digital screen. A fresh, high-definition audio file instantly cut through the heavy, lingering tension of the grand ballroom, echoing with crystal clarity over the premium sound system. The undeniable crisp sound of Aaliyah's own voice actively filled the massive acoustic space, completely lacking the tragic, fearful tone she was currently projecting. The secret recording captured a private late-night conversation between her and Brent, where she eagerly and maliciously orchestrated the exact dosages required to chemically sedate me. She actively instructed her husband on how to illegally manipulate my blood pressure medication to rapidly accelerate my physical decline and ensure my swift, involuntary commitment to the state nursing facility. The chilling audio exposed her laughing cruelly about my total impending cognitive destruction, treating my forced chemical lobotomy as a highly amusing corporate strategy. The elite crowd gasped in sheer absolute horror as they listened to a daughter actively conspire to chemically poison her own devoted father for a piece of real estate. Her entire pathetic facade of victimhood was instantaneously, permanently annihilated by the undeniable sound of her own toxic, ruthless ambition. Aaliyah physically recoiled from the massive speakers as the damning recording of her own cruel laughter actively condemned her in front of the entire city. She dropped her hands from my trousers and slumped backward onto the wooden stage, completely paralyzed by the absolute, undeniable exposure of her ultimate betrayal. Her mouth opened and closed in rapid, silent succession, entirely unable to formulate a single coherent lie to counter the devastating forensic truth. I looked directly into her terrified, wide eyes and spoke with a low, thunderous clarity that carried perfectly across the silent ballroom. I stated plainly that she had actively chosen the filthy, stolen money of a generational thief over her own sacred bloodline, entirely sacrificing her soul for temporary corporate luxury. I told her that she possessed the exact same dark, parasitic disease that had completely destroyed Brent's father decades ago, and she fully deserved to share in his catastrophic final harvest. I did not wait for her to offer another pathetic weeping apology or beg for a final shred of unearned mercy. I stepped smoothly around her trembling, collapsed form, entirely breaking all physical and emotional contact with the woman I had once raised. I raised my right hand and delivered a single sharp tactical motion directly toward the heavy perimeter doors. The lead federal agent immediately acknowledged the silent command and rapidly directed a squad of heavily armed officers toward the main stage. The imposing men marched briskly up the carpeted stairs and forcefully hauled Aaliyah to her feet, aggressively securing the cold steel cuffs around her manicured wrists. She screamed hysterically as they physically dragged her away from the opulent crystal chandeliers, completely severing her from her luxurious stolen reality. The total eradication of my enemies was now flawlessly absolute. The brutal click of the heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut around Brent's wrists echoed with finality over the chaotic din of the grand ballroom. Two massive federal tactical agents forcefully hauled him up from the polished hardwood stage floor, completely ignoring his pathetic whimpers of protest. The bespoke Italian suit that had projected an aura of invincible corporate authority just an hour ago was now violently wrinkled and soaked in the cold sweat of an utterly defeated man. Brent dragged his feet across the pristine marble, completely stripped of his arrogant posture as the officers physically propelled him toward the heavy brass exit doors. The relentless, blinding flashes of a dozen local news cameras actively documented every single agonizing second of his catastrophic public downfall. The blinding white light cast harsh, unforgiving shadows across his terrified face, permanently burning the image of his absolute ruin into the public consciousness. He frantically tried to shield his face from the glaring lenses, but the tight steel cuffs severely restricted his movements, leaving his humiliation entirely exposed to the world. The wealthy elite investors who had gathered to worship his visionary genius now actively shrank back into the shadows, ensuring they were not caught in the explosive collateral damage of his federal arrest. Brent was unceremoniously shoved through the grand entrance and out into the freezing night air, completely swallowed by the flashing red and blue lights of the waiting transport vehicles. His fraudulent empire was officially dead. Aaliyah did not fare any better under the uncompromising grip of the federal justice system. A female tactical officer firmly grasped her upper arm and actively marched her away from the shattered remnants of her pristine aristocratic illusion. Her expensive designer gown dragged heavily across the ballroom floor, gathering dust and spilled champagne as she openly wept in sheer genuine panic. The thick layer of flawless makeup that usually masked her cruel ambition was completely ruined by dark streaks of mascara running down her trembling cheeks. She was being formally processed as a direct willing accessory to massive corporate wire fraud and attempted chemical assault. Aaliyah cast one final desperate look over her shoulder toward the brightly lit stage, but encountered only the cold backs of the federal agents actively dismantling her husband's physical legacy. The swift, unyielding arm of the state did not hesitate to execute the immediate total liquidation of Brent's entire holding company. Dozens of highly specialized forensic accountants and government auditors rapidly swarmed the perimeter, immediately freezing every single corporate bank account and offshore trust associated with the toxic development project. The massive architectural model that had proudly dominated the center of the room was officially tagged as federal evidence and forcefully confiscated by the tactical team. Every single heavily leveraged asset, every stolen commercial deed, and every fraudulent shell corporation was instantaneously seized by the highest judicial authorities. The glittering $90 million corporate facade was entirely dismantled piece by piece right in front of the stunned, silent crowd. Aaliyah was forcefully shoved into the back of a separate armored transport vehicle, entirely stripped of the unearned luxury she had brutally poisoned her own father to secure. The heavy steel door slammed shut permanently, locking her inside a dark, terrifying reality she could no longer manipulate. The sprawling grand ballroom rapidly emptied as the panicked elite socialites and terrified municipal officials frantically fled the scene of the massive federal raid. I stood perfectly still behind the polished glass podium, surrounded entirely by the quiet, echoing aftermath of a 35-year war. I did not allow a single smile or an ounce of triumphant joy to cross my hardened features. There was absolutely no lingering joy to be found in the violent, necessary destruction of my own bloodline. I simply raised my hands and methodically straightened the sharp lapels of my tailored charcoal suit, adjusting my dark silk tie with cold, deliberate precision. Harvey approached me from the shadows of the main stage, moving with the quiet, dignified respect of a brilliant legal architect witnessing the final flawless execution of his masterpiece. He reached into his midnight blue jacket and silently handed me a crisp, pristine manila envelope bearing the heavy, embossed seal of the Municipal Property Registry. I slid my fingers inside the thick paper and extracted the original uncontested physical deed to my historic family brownstone. This was not a freshly printed document, but the exact original parchment my late wife and I had proudly signed decades ago before the relentless corporate predators actively conspired to rip our lives apart. Brent's wicked father had utilized ruthless illegal leverage to violently steal this exact property, triggering the cascading tragedy that ultimately kidnapped my only son and forced me into 3 decades of agonizing janitorial servitude. Reclaiming this fragile piece of paper was not simply about acquiring prime real estate, but rather actively restoring the fundamental bedrock of my stolen legacy. I carefully folded the heavy document and secured it deep inside my inner breast pocket, exactly where it rightfully belonged. Jamari stepped quietly up to my right side, projecting the immense calming authority of a man who had finally conquered the dark, suffocating ghosts of his stolen childhood. We stood shoulder to shoulder on the abandoned wooden stage, 2 generations of survivors violently reunited by a shared, unyielding dedication to absolute justice. The intense, glaring spotlights illuminating the empty space suddenly felt entirely hollow and meaningless against the profound, silent weight of our victory. Jamari looked out over the scattered, overturned champagne flutes and discarded luxury garments littering the expansive marble floor. He gave a single firm nod, silently acknowledging the total, absolute eradication of the corrupt empire that had actively tried to bury us both. We did not exchange a single spoken word because the profound magnitude of the moment entirely transcended the need for verbal confirmation. I turned my back on the shattered remnants of Brent's fraudulent ambition and began a slow, deliberate march down the carpeted stairs. Jamari matched my steady, rhythmic pace, perfectly walking beside me as an equal partner, rather than a lost, stolen child. Our polished leather shoes struck the pristine marble floor in perfect, absolute unison, echoing loudly through the massive, deserted corridor. We bypassed the heavy brass entrance doors and stepped out into the crisp, refreshing night air, completely leaving the suffocating, toxic atmosphere of the luxury hotel far behind us. The flashing red and blue lights of the federal transport vehicles were already fading into the distant city traffic, carrying our defeated enemies toward their permanent concrete cages. We walked together into the quiet, brightly lit streets of the financial district, entirely ready to build a new, unbreakable empire from the ashes of the old. 6 months actively passed since the flashing red and blue lights swallowed the wreckage of the grand ballroom. The relentless pace of the federal justice system completely processed the massive scale of the corporate fraud without a single ounce of leniency. Brent currently resides within the cold concrete walls of a maximum security federal penitentiary, serving a mandatory 25-year sentence for orchestrating the elaborate wire fraud and illegal property extortion. The pristine, tailored Italian suits that once defined his arrogant existence are permanently replaced by a standard-issue coarse khaki uniform. The sprawling $90 million commercial development project he proudly claimed as his visionary masterpiece was completely dismantled by government auditors and sold off in fractured pieces to compensate his massive list of defrauded investors. The aggressive media spectacle surrounding his dramatic arrest completely obliterated his family legacy, ensuring that his corrupt name will strictly be remembered as a cautionary tale of unchecked predatory greed. His highly publicized trial offered absolutely zero escape routes because Harvey had meticulously assembled an impenetrable fortress of forensic accounting and irrefutable audio evidence. Brent attempted to plea bargain his way into a lighter sentence, but the sheer magnitude of his financial crimes triggered the absolute maximum federal penalties available. He spends his long, silent days entirely confined to a narrow cell, completely stripped of the lavish, aristocratic illusions he brutally stole from innocent people. The generational cycle of corporate theft he inherited and weaponized is officially permanently eradicated from the financial sector. Aaliyah experienced an equally devastating collapse into absolute obscurity. The swift federal asset seizure immediately locked her out of the sprawling downtown penthouses and completely drained the luxurious offshore accounts she had viciously protected. She now occupies a cramped, poorly insulated studio apartment situated on the absolute lowest income perimeter of the city limits. The glamorous socialite who eagerly plotted to chemically sedate her own father for real estate capital now actively struggles to afford basic weekly groceries. The sharp, agonizing reality of physical labor and strictly budgeted utility bills completely shattered her lifelong delusion of unearned superiority. She attempts to manipulate her way out of the suffocating poverty by sending me weekly handwritten letters filled with desperate, hysterical apologies and pathetic pleas for immediate financial salvation. The thick envelopes arrive consistently every single Tuesday morning, actively stuffed with detailed accounts of her miserable living conditions and promises of total personal reform. I do not bother reading a single carefully crafted sentence. I simply walk directly to the front porch and immediately return every single sealed envelope straight back into the postal system marked strictly as undeliverable. She actively chose to align her soul with a ruthless generational thief, completely severing our sacred bloodline the moment she handed my house keys to a demolition crew. My deep paternal love was violently, permanently extinguished by the clear, undeniable audio recording of her cruel laughter echoing through the grand ballroom. Allowing her back into my reality would simply invite the toxic parasite to quietly attach itself to my restored foundation. I actively maintained the absolute rigid boundary of silence, entirely abandoning her to navigate the harsh, unforgiving consequences of her own blinding ambition without any safety net. I stood quietly beside Jamari under the heavy, sprawling branches of the ancient oak trees lining the perimeter of the local municipal cemetery. The crisp afternoon air carried the faint scent of fresh pine as we walked methodically toward the polished granite headstone resting peacefully near the crest of the green hill. I gently placed a vibrant arrangement of fresh white lilies directly onto the manicured grass, marking the final resting place of my late wife, Josephine. Jamari stared intently at the elegant carved lettering spelling out his mother's name, completely absorbing the profound emotional weight of the silent reunion. I spoke softly into the quiet afternoon breeze, officially introducing the brilliant corporate titan standing beside me to the fiercely devoted woman who had never once stopped looking for him. I detailed how Josephine had spent the final agonizing decade of her life relentlessly pursuing every single fractured lead and hiring private investigators with the tiny, meager wages we managed to save. She actively fought through the suffocating despair of the violent kidnapping, refusing to ever accept the false police narratives suggesting our child was permanently lost. The debilitating illness that eventually claimed her physical body was entirely accelerated by the immense crushing stress of Brent's father actively stalling the ongoing municipal investigations with his corrupt bureaucratic leverage. Josephine crossed over into the next life holding a faded photograph of her beautiful boy, completely sustained by the absolute unyielding faith that he was still actively fighting to survive. Jamari knelt slowly onto the damp grass and gently rested his palm against the cold granite stone, silently honoring the immense, unbroken maternal love that had miraculously guided him back from the dark abyss to execute our final revenge. We drove in comfortable silence back through the bustling city streets, completely leaving the heavy solemnity of the cemetery behind us. Jamari pulled his sleek black vehicle directly up to the pristine curb of our fully restored historic family brownstone. The magnificent multi-story brick structure stood proudly under the warm, glowing light of the descending sun, entirely protected from the vicious corporate demolition orders that had nearly erased it from the map. I did not need to scream, throw violent punches, or physically attack the arrogant predators who had actively tried to destroy my existence. I patiently and meticulously orchestrated a strictly silent adjustment entirely built upon the exact same legal and financial weapons they had historically utilized to oppress the vulnerable. The entire fraudulent empire of lies was flawlessly dismantled from the inside out, simply by allowing their own blinding greed to actively trigger their total annihilation. We walked up the solid stone steps and sat down heavily on the polished wooden rocking chairs adorning the wide front porch. I handed my son a steaming ceramic mug of fresh, dark-roasted coffee and settled back to watch the vibrant orange sunset actively bleed across the quiet neighborhood skyline. The agonizing 35-year war was officially decisively concluded, leaving no remaining enemies on the battlefield. The missing child who was violently ripped from his crib had miraculously returned as a highly lethal corporate executioner, perfectly restoring the stolen foundation of our family legacy. We sat quietly drinking our coffee in the fading twilight, completely surrounded by the absolute, undeniable peace of a perfectly maintained order. The booming sound of Brent's frantic, desperate excuses was instantly overpowered by a sharp, digital click echoing ominously through the massive ballroom speakers. The towering projection screen directly behind us immediately shifted from the forged property deed to a stark black audio waveform pulsating with lethal rhythmic precision. A crystal-clear, high-definition audio recording flooded the opulent space, capturing the exact, unmistakable arrogance of Brent's voice, perfectly preserved from a hidden microphone I had secretly planted inside his private executive office weeks ago. The entire grand room fell completely dead silent as the recorded voice of the supposed visionary titan proudly bragged about ruthlessly stealing the historic family estate from an ignorant old janitor. The pristine audio file captured Brent callously detailing his exact meticulous strategy to fraudulently leverage the stolen property deed to secure massive illegal offshore loans. Every single filthy detail of his criminal conspiracy was broadcasted loudly and undeniably directly into the ears of the exact elite investors he was desperately trying to court. A profound collective gasp of pure, utter revulsion tore through the wealthy crowd as they listened to him actively mock their financial gullibility on the pristine digital recording. The devastating, irrefutable proof completely shattered his final remaining facade of corporate legitimacy. The city mayor, who had been standing proudly near the grand entrance just moments earlier, instantly turned completely white. He immediately recognized the massive, catastrophic political fallout of being publicly associated with a blatant federal criminal conspiracy. He aggressively shoved his way through the dense crowd of panicked socialites and walked briskly out of the heavy brass doors without looking back. Brent was now entirely abandoned, entirely exposed, and completely surrounded by the total devastating ruins of his own unparalleled greed. True wealth is never constructed upon a fragile foundation of deception, manipulation, and the ruthless exploitation of family. Greed frequently blinds individuals to the quiet, observant resilience of those they underestimate, leading arrogant predators to carelessly engineer their own spectacular downfalls. The ultimate victory does not require chaotic screaming or physical violence. It demands profound patience, meticulous documentation, and the cold execution of undeniable truth. When you actively choose to value stolen luxury over genuine human connection, you will inevitably find yourself entirely abandoned in your darkest hour, completely consumed by the devastating consequences of your own unchecked toxic ambition. If you enjoyed this story of patience, justice, and absolute reckoning, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments which part of Antoine's flawless revenge was your absolute favorite. Stay tuned for more incredible life stories.